Good. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the TriMet Board's annual retreat. I guess it's been annual for quite a number of years. Um, Oftentimes, we have a meeting where the board is doing most of the talking and having some dialogue with the staff on key issues. I think what we've got today is a lot of information the staff has been saving up. I think really wants to talk with us about that is important to the future of TriMet. So clearly, it's a good retreat session, and a lot of it pertains to funding and the future. And I think the agenda, if everybody has it, we're starting with kind of the as we call it, the dissection of the election, and then we go into some of the business plans that we need to have to link together our strategic financial plan along with our operations. And then I think the staff is really saying we want to have a dialogue about some of the key issues that confront the agency and are looking for our feedback. So I'm hoping that even though there's going to be a lot of staff presentations today, that the board actually can dig in and give the staff some feedback on these things, because I think there's some fairly meaty and important issues here that we have an opportunity to talk about today. So I don't want to take much more time. Do you want to introduce the first two speakers, Neil?
Oh, happy to.
Okay.
Certainly, you know the one toward the right, my right, far right here, which is Bernie Bottomley, our Director of Public Affairs. But I do want to particularly introduce Dan Levy, who's actually a very one of these sort of designated smart people that sometimes Earl Blumenauer comes out and talks about. But he's the lead of the Gallatin Group, one of the I think premier public affairs firms, and we've had the opportunity to take advantage of their services in the past and have learned to really respect the opinions of Dan. So I thought it'd be a very helpful thing for us all to sort of hear what he has to say about the trends and the outcomes of the election. And then Bernie's here to fill in some of the details, particularly I think on the local side. So.
Let me take it away.
So, go ahead. Well, I'll just add to that. Dan is one of the premier thinkers in Oregon on political issues. Former chief of staff to Senator Gordon Smith. Dan has a past related to light rail and TriMet. When Senator Smith was in the Oregon legislature, Dan was one of the folks that worked with the senator around a strategy for running statewide, and introduced him to the notion of light rail and TriMet, and was an important factor in Senator Smith adopting light rail as a cause and an issue that he wanted to be active in. And so we appreciate that long history with Dan.
Me and Dick Feeney.
Yeah, exactly. And in addition to that work, of course, he runs the Gallatin Group, is the president of the Gallatin Group, which is one of the premier political firms in the state and in the Pacific Northwest. Sits on the U of O Alumni Association board, so he's at home here in this building, on the Portland Business Alliance board as well. We sit together on the Pioneer Courthouse Square board, and Dan chairs that. And in addition to that, his lovely wife Lori is a real powerhouse in Oregon in the fundraising realm, and we've used her from time to time for projects that we have. And his two kids, Max and Piper, are wonderful additions to the state and are future U of O Duck attendees, probably, if Dad has...
One of them, maybe.
Well, no, anyway. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Dan. I thought this is good context for a lot of the things that we're going to talk about for the rest of the day, both at the state and federal level, because a lot of the projects and initiatives that are on our agenda have a federal funding component or a state funding component. So the context is important for the remaining discussion.
I'll try to localize things as much as possible, but obviously, I was saying to Neil earlier, every once in a while you actually can feel like you're in the middle of history, and today and last night were one of those days. I grew up riding the 54 and 56 buses. I'm proud to say that my son, Max, 13, rode the 56 for his first time alone this summer. and still will take the bus on occasion from my house. It's not this, the stop is closed. And yeah, I when I went to U of O, I wrote my history thesis on planning, and not really thesis, history graduating paper on planning in Portland and the role that transit played in that. So I've always been interested in urban American history, Portland history, the role that planning plays, and obviously transit is completely linked, particularly in our community, with the growth of the community and planning and that sort of thing. So I'm always happy to be here and appreciate the good work that TriMet does. I get frequently asked to sit on panels or give remarks for client groups or different things, civic organizations. I've been doing a lot of, in election years, I end up doing a lot of it. Free entertainment is essentially why, I think. And so I've had a fair amount of time and spent a fair amount of time the last 7 or 8 months giving talks about what's happening in politics nationally and what's driving it. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about that, and then maybe comment on some of the local measures and try to drive a point home about why any of this is important for institutions like a transit agency and the work that you folks do. I think there's really, if you look at the election last night and you set aside the personalities, which is really hard to do with the two particular presidential candidates that we had for obvious reasons. But I think there's really been 4 factors that have been driving the currents of politics that resulted in the election, the presidential national election result last night, which is really an amazing historic event. One, this is the consequences of personal economic stagnation. We've had now over a decade of economic growth at less than 2%. In medieval times, people would grab the pitchforks and storm the castle, and that's happened a little bit here. But you can't have economic stagnation without having consequences on the politics and the culture. Suspicion of all things big. Big media, big government, maybe even a big transit agency. I think one of the things, a trend that I've observed in my 25 years in politics is the complete collapse and decline in the last generation of public confidence in major institutions, from the Catholic Church to Major League Baseball, two wars that the country has lost, I think, in the minds of most Americans. So if you look at most institutions and the things that were the pillars in our communities or in our nation over the last really 25 years, and think of how they're perceived in today, you think about institutions like the European Union and Brexit, and institutions like the Republican Party, which has been ripped apart and rejected and reformed in an odd way in the last year. And the same has happened among the Democratic Party in the last year. I'll get to the more but suspicion of things big. The rise of populism, both on the left and the right, and that's I think a function of the economics, but also, and I think in a really blue left coast state like Oregon, it's easy for us to discount because our demographics and our politics here are unique to the coast or the coasts. But the impact of culture, we don't talk about culture a lot in Oregon as a kind of a live and let live place and all of that, but one of the impacts of the election was really Middle America's rejection of a political correctness culture that has been emerging, and identity politics that's really started to animate, particularly on the Democratic side, but just a part of the normal course of doing business. Even if you just think about in the last year, particularly the last 3 or 4 months, how the media has talked about segments of the electorate. Almost matter-of-factly, like, white male, no college. Females, under 30, unmarried. I think for a lot of Americans, there's a kind of an uncomfortable rejection of that. Putting labels on everybody. There's a lot of isms, a lot of hyphenating. that's going on. And I think you saw a middle American rejection of all of that cultural components. And then you get this rise of populism on the left and the right. And the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movement are really two sides of the same coin. Share actually a lot in common: a distrust of Wall Street, distrust of big business. Methods are a little different, but I think that it's not a coincidence that those movements rose and have advanced at on parallel courses. And one could argue that Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump on the right are the presidential manifestations of Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party movement. The third item is the advancement of technology and communications. And mostly I think the impact on that has been two things. We can always talk about all the positive things about technology and communication. But I think on the negative side is it's created a more tribal environment. All of us now in the websites and the different places that we go for information, I think we all kind of gravitate towards things that maybe reinforce some of our own beliefs rather than going to places that challenge our beliefs. That's probably human nature, but it's an outgrowth. I also think it breeds alienation. As a father of a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old battling their use of technology, but I think it's the alienation that comes with being able to have the world literally in your hand, and the lack of personal interaction that happens, frankly, and that used to happen in civic institutions like Rotary clubs or in churches or at a bus stop. I'm sure that the habits at a bus stop now are dramatically different than they were 15 years ago. I would imagine everybody is staring at their device and not talking to one another, whereas 15 years ago, people visited about what was happening in their community or on the train or what have you. So I remember when I was an intern in Washington, D.C., and started taking the metro, and this was in the mid-'80s, and after a while, after a few days, you kind of have the same people, they're in the same seats, and it almost becomes a community on a bus or a train. And I think technology has eliminated probably a lot of that culture that goes on. So in short, as I summarize, it's really a loss of control. I think that a lot of people are feeling, and both economic, culturally, and political in those three areas. And I think the presidential election last night was a manifestation of trying to reassert some control, or a large portion of our country, mostly I'll call it middle America, trying to reassert control under threat culturally, economically, politically, by big media, by big politics, by big business, and then the decline of institutions. In the old days, I hope there's no bankers listening, but 15, 20 years ago, think of the role that a bank played in a community, and now how they're viewed. And it's just a dramatic change. Maybe the only institution in America that hasn't been, that still is held in high regard, and I've seen a lot of public opinion research on this, is the U.S. military. But even just think of what's happened to the FBI in the last 6 months. You can argue good decisions, bad decisions, and all that, but I think, up until a few months ago, we all believed that the institution, the most important law enforcement agency in our country, was sort of beyond politics. And so I just think everywhere you look, institutions are being challenged. I'd also say one last thing is a loss of virtue and a rise of celebrity in our politics. And I don't say that just about Donald Trump. Barack Obama was a celebrity when he was elected. He was, arguably, Andrew Jackson was a celebrity, but it's easy, because of Mr. Trump being on television, but, there's a celebrity culture that we live in now. And I think understanding the intersection of politics and culture and economics is really something that I like to be a student of, and I think it is relevant for your organization and to local, as TriMet as an institution in this community. and you're a mover of people, and I think trying to understand those things and how people interact with their government, of which you are a form, in a very practical level, is really important to think about. So with that, I don't know, we want to have a little conversation, or should I talk about some of the local measures?
You guys want to ask questions at the federal level?
Maybe when you're done, I think I
Okay.
have some questions about maybe what you think it means.
Well, I did have one thought last night. You know, Mr. Trump basically mentioned one issue in his speech last night. Trains, infrastructure. He's a builder. You know, he's not a traditional Republican. Not that Republicans are opposed to infrastructure. He's a populist, and he's a builder. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see the shoulder that he and his administration put behind rebuilding America. It's so I was struck by that last night, thinking about coming here this morning, that really the one thing he chose to highlight of all the things he could have talked about last night was, you know, roads and bridges and trains and infrastructure. So I do think that that's going to be an interesting opportunity for the country. We've been stymied, I think, for, you know, about a decade, and really at the federal level, you know, we used to have these 6-year renewals on transportation funding and all those sorts of things. So it'll be interesting to see the fresh approach that a builder president, who actually talked about this quite a bit in his campaign, takes to the issues that are important to a transit agency. And you guys have always been so great about having your projects ready to go and be, you know, first in line or third in line. For a small state, that's quite an accomplishment. So that could be a very interesting piece. Turning to the local measures of the statewide. Oh yeah.
Quote, rebuilding America, end quote. Is that just bridges?
Well, last night he said trains, he said bridges, he said tunnels, airports, hospitals. So I think transit probably fits in there. I mean, he's a New Yorker after all, born and raised. So I mean, this is a guy who, you know, even if he hasn't been riding the subway, he knows how important it is.
Now, if I may continue.
Sure.
What's the impact on people? If we've been stymied for a decade, and we have a lot of atrocities, and I can describe them as that of happening to people that we call Americans and he calls un-Americans.
Yeah.
What's the impact politically, culturally, economically, and even celebrity-wise, as you've stated, as things to watch?
Well, I was talking about this with my wife the other night, that you know, there are elections where you have two candidates and you assume that their character is generally acceptable. They may have a completely different point of view on outlook on government. You know, let's call the traditional Republican small government versus Democrat larger government, you know. This election has been uniquely divisive in the issue I think that you're raising, which is that this was essentially a character contest between two individuals. And for the most part, we didn't settle any real issues in this election. They were barely discussed. You had two larger-than-life personalities attacking the hell out of each other and questioning their motives every single day. And at the end of the day, you know, there's an old deal in historical politics about the clown versus the crook. And historically, they always say that the crook usually wins. In this case, maybe the clown won and the crook lost. But I don't think in my lifetime I've ever seen anything like this in terms of the necessity of repair and healing and grace that is going to be required. And when you think about Donald Trump, you don't generally associate the word grace with him. But I think I didn't support Trump. I wrote in John Kasich. So I'd already kind of come, and I assumed Hillary was going to win. So I've spent the last 3 months kind of, you know, as I do most elections, that America is bigger than one single election or one single person. And I think it is. I think the ideas and values and principles of America transcend as an individual. But we're going to find out if the adage about the job making a person grow is applicable with Mr. Trump or not. Mrs. Clinton's speech, which I think is probably occurring right now, and the president's speech in a couple hours will, along with Mr. Trump's remarks last night, will help set the tone. But there is no doubt that there's half of America that is not just upset about the outcome of an election, but feels that, probably questioning the entire foundation of their country this morning. So it's going to be a big job. We'll see if he's up to it. I hope he is, for all of us. I'm an optimist. Local issues. It's always dangerous to, prognosticate. I'll pat myself on the back a little bit about Measure 97. I'll share what I've been saying for about 6 months on this. I've always thought it was an overreach, too big, and in an economic environment where there wasn't a clear rationale and demonstrated need. A lot of people have made some analogies to or comparisons between Measure 97 and the measures 6 years ago or 7 years ago, measures 66 and 67. The big difference between those tax increases that were on the ballot and this one was, at that time, we were in the middle of an economic crisis. I think people realized that, we were in tough times and we needed to perhaps rally together to fix something. Secondly, those taxes had been already approved and were funding current services, and they were being repealed. And so you literally were repealing money from programs, not just proposing aspirationally new funding. And then in the course of this argument, if you think about it, the proponents of 97 made 4 arguments. And with each successive argument, they went from 63% down to about 40%. One, they argued that the tax system is unfair and corporations were paying their fair share. 2, they argued that we needed a lot more money for mostly education and healthcare. 3, that if we didn't pass it, there were going to be huge budget cuts and dire consequences. And 4, that it was actually good for small business, not going to hurt it. Now, when you're running a political campaign and you reach a point where you're putting an economist on television to sell your campaign and your idea, you've usually lost. Now, the irony is it's usually Republicans that are trying to do that. But I think, I just know because I've done it, I've made this mistake. When you're trying to sell an economic theory in a political campaign and you're trying to get a yes vote, that's a really hard thing to do. So I wasn't really surprised. It was surprised me at the margin. My office pool, I had about 55-45, where I thought it would come down. It's also the power of, if you get into sort of the technicalities of a political campaign, a lot of attention is on how much money the opposition spent to defeat it. I think close to $25 million. The value in that money is not just the volume of arguments that you can make, but that you can make 2 or 3 or 4 arguments concurrently at the same time, talking to different people. And with a smaller budget, you have to make one argument against it, and then change your television advertising, make another argument against it, and then rotate, make another argument against it. The real value in having that amount of money is that they could make consistently 3 or 4 different arguments against it. The money wasn't going to go to where it was being spent, that it was going to cost jobs, that it was a hidden sales tax, those sorts of things. So my belief is that they had a lot more arguments to make against it than there were arguments to make for it, and that the overall economic environment didn't call out for this. I do public opinion research in Oregon. I probably do 5 or 6 surveys a year, and have for 25 years. So have the good fortune for different clients to be able to track different things. Oftentimes we'll throw questions on there. And education, for quite a long time, actually, when you ask people the question in Oregon, do you need more money or do you need structural reforms to the system? It's usually a jump ball. about 45. So, when you're sort of working in the chattering class, and there's a conventional wisdom about the need for more money for schools. But I think that one of the messages of 97 is, before we're going to give you a massive amount of new money, we'd like to see you do innovate and change and reform. And those are issues I'm sure you folks have dealt with as well when you go to voters for funding of anything. And people know a lot more about their government than they used to. You know what I mean? It was when I started, or when Bernie was starting, a few postcards might arrive, some phone calls at the office. Elected officials were somewhat insulated from their constituents. Now, some argue that that's good for democracy because it allows deals to be made. The flip side is nowadays the public is much more engaged and much more connected. Lawmakers and legislators are just as likely to be influenced by what they read on their Facebook feed walking between votes in the Capitol as they are what me or Bernie or somebody else might do if we're trying to walk the halls of the Capitol. So the whole nature of advocacy has evolved. What's going to happen now? Well, now you're going to realize why I'm a Republican. Since I started working in state politics in the late 80s, one thing is certain, or has been certain, is every 2 years, when it's time for the governor's budget to come out, we have either a $900 million or $1.3 billion deficit. We have that when times are bad, in the depth of the recession, and we have it now when the economy is supposedly running at full throttle, according to the state economist. So there is definitely a structural, permanent deficit that has been around Oregon state government now for about 20 years. A couple times we've raised taxes to close it, but most times they balance the budget. The state continues to, go on. And we've also, the prioritization of spending has, dramatically shifted, where you have there's growth in government generally, but the growth in pensions and entitlements, and particularly Medicaid, is growing faster than our spending on education and infrastructure and transportation. And you can make an argument that at a strictly economic level, that investments in infrastructure and education are things that create over the long term economic opportunities. And spending on social programs, while critically important, they tend to treat the consequences of a lack of opportunity. And so the combination of rising resources for the state, and the big pension issue, and obviously you all have dealt with that over the years for your own finances. That's all going to really come to head here with this next legislative session. There's an old adage in life, and certainly in politics, that be careful the question you ask if you don't know the answer. And so the government sector unions that put this on the ballot asked a question. More money for schools, change the tax structure for corporations, avoid a budget deficit, help small business. Well, those arguments all got defeated 60-40 heading into a legislative session. There definitely will be calls for more taxes. Actually, last week, before the votes were even counted, there was already people saying, oh God, if Measure 97 passes, we got to have another tax increase. I think that discussion will occur, but I would be shocked if the legislature adopted a significant tax increase after 60% of the voters just voted down a tax increase. So they're going to have to figure that out. It's going to require leadership from the governor, and she's now been elected as a mandate. I think she won it by about 10 or 11 points. So the burden is really on her now, particularly as someone who supported the measure, to step up with a budget. There will be talk of tax increases, but I just think at the end of the day, I would be shocked if they balance this budget with a tax increase. I do think that the prospects for a transportation package, while they've been on essentially hold, like almost everything else with Spectre 97 hanging around them, I do think there is a deal to be had there. But I will just say, and I'll take this point of view as a Republican and somebody who worked in the legislature when we did some transit things, we tried to do a transportation plan, is that Republicans are conflicted between wanting to support their Chamber of Commerce constituency, who generally favors infrastructure spending and transit and roads and that sort of thing, and their constituents who want congestion and relief, particularly in the suburbs, and their anti-tax instincts. Although I've never seen anybody lose an election over supporting a gas tax. So I think that can get a little overblown. And then on the Democratic side, and this is a more recent phenomenon, they generally would just, knee-jerk, sure, I'll support any tax increase. Now it's tied to environmental policy. And that's an added element maybe of the last 5 or 6 years about conditioning support for transportation funding on environmental policies that either mitigate carbon or do different things. And so they're a less reliable. So if you move to the right trying to get Republican votes, the things that the Republicans may want in a transportation package may lose you votes on the far left. So there's probably a deal to be had for a transportation plan, but the far right and the far left they're going to be no votes. So you gotta find the votes in the middle and work your way out. Do you think that's right? Yeah. And that's a really hard thing to do. It's much easier in politics to move from the left to the center or the right to the center than start in the center and move out. And so, while you guys are the experts on the value of transit and transportation and roads and all that kind of stuff, guys like me, we just look at how you find the votes. So that'll be an interesting thing. I think Measure 97 failing, ironically, maybe increases the likelihood of a transportation package. But again, that's going to require a lot of leadership from the governor. Governors pitch, legislators catch. It's very hard to drive an agenda from the legislative branch. Don't tell legislative leaders that. But it's difficult to do. And so again, a lot's going to ride on the governor driving that process. One final thing is one election that I thought was kind of interesting and maybe underscored some of the things we're talking about at the presidential level or these larger trends in our society. And that's the defeat of Steve Novick. Now, I will call Steve a friend. I mean, I think I disagree with him on almost everything, but for years we were a point counterpoint on different things, and I've always enjoyed his company. He got beat by, I can't even, I'm going to mispronounce her name, so I won't say it, Udley. I joked with Steve when I saw him recently that I asked Steve, how did it feel to be running as the Republican in his race for city commissioner? So he had a candidate to his left, but fundamentally it was a candidacy that I think contained some of these same characteristics about anti-establishment, anti-authority, questioning anything big in establishment. I think that's just an interesting thing for an organization like yours to keep in mind as you're thinking about how you communicate with your public. Neil was telling me when I was asking him about this format what this was, and I actually think what you're doing here in terms of having very open, transparent meetings and all that kind of good stuff is really, really important for public institutions. It maybe make things a little more cumbersome, a little harder to do, but people are watching and people are engaged, and technology has connected people in ways to their government, of which you are, that you wouldn't have even dreamed of just a few years ago. So I think suspicion of the political process and how decisions are made, that's a part of one of the great American traditions, right? Suspicions of government. That's a good thing. But I think, technology and other things have just made it, embedded it in a way that there's almost a sinister element in it. So you've got to, I think, constantly be working as a government institution to build trust. And I think that starts with, open and transparent decision making. So that maybe sounds like a namby-pamby deal, but I think it's really I think there's a practical implication to it. I think I'll stop there.
Questions, thoughts?
You want to give us the local, is that what we're going to do, a little more even dive down?
I can cover that actually a little bit later.
Okay, all right.
In the day. So if there are questions, I think.
Well, I think that, I guess my observation is I heard Donald Trump say the same things about infrastructure and putting folks back to work. And, it's been interesting because the Republicans usually have been very supportive of projects. Not so much transit,
Right.
Usually it's highways and bridges at the expense of transit, which I want to understand how that works. So I guess, what's your thoughts in terms of what's actually going to happen at the national level to actually get beyond that, and how does that relate to actually a long-term funding source for transportation? Because that's what I think is probably going to be lost in this, is we're going to have to deal with, again, more year-to-year type things. But just any observations or thoughts on that would be really helpful.
Well, I probably can't offer any insight into it other than it's really about that that moving from the center out in terms of building your coalition and finding your votes. Again, I think that the transit versus pavement, call it, is a part of that environmental versus economic component. When I was working in the legislature in the mid '90s, it was a bit. I remember when the South North Light Rail. It's that South North. There's a few people who remember that. There's a saying in politics that pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered, and we larded up a bill to get the funding for the South North Light Rail with a whole bunch of road projects. You remember that? And then Bill Sizemore put it on the ballot, and the voters repealed it. So I think you're far better off being very precise about projects, and it may make it more complicated that you don't have big permanent funding sources. But I just think you're far better off approaching it that way, even though it's not how you'd logically do things. A more efficient way is to be able to plan 10 or 15 years out, but you guys have done a terrific job of kind of putting projects in the queue and then going to the voters. I think that, ironically, in a funny way, Sizemore probably did transit some favors. He probably didn't intend it that way. But I know that the pork barreling that we did in that situation just to get the votes through the legislative process, I tend to respect the wisdom of the voters, and in that case, they said it was excessive, and they didn't know what they were getting. So my only advice, my advice is, I know you'd love a big funding source. We all would for almost anything, but I think you're far better off building consensus around need and projects, and then focusing on that. So that's just my advice.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah.
All right. Other questions, comments from the board?
Thank you, Dan. Great information. Greatly appreciated. I want to go back to what you were referencing in the beginning in regards to, all of the components. And I got to say that, as I sit here, I'm significantly confused as to how do we take what we've just seen and roll this into future decisions that we have to make as an agency. And as I look across the electoral map, it very much, for the most part, looked the same as it did in 2012, except for the Democratic strongholds of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But if you look at of course, Florida isn't necessarily a Democratic stronghold. But as you look at those, as you look at that electoral map, I begin to question what truly is driving what just occurred in regards to this, not just president, but we've got the House and the Senate that are both controlled by the same party. So as we look at all of those things, and as we roll this into transit and the potential implications that we face as an organization, I tend to start thinking about, okay, what is did we really just see a significant referendum to the quote unquote establishment, or did we see something more along the lines of this whole celebrity concept where you did have, some significant change in some major states that really swayed the election. Ultimately, as I think about the folks that are most impacted by a potential decline in transit spending, are the folks on the lower rungs, the transit dependent. Many of those folks are very, very similar to the way I look, and that to me is troubling. If that truly is some major referendum, and we're going to start to see a significant shift in the sentiment towards things that really are designed to lift the impoverished out of poverty, that's concerning. And so as I sit here, that's where my confusion comes from, because as I'm thinking and trying to process all of this, it's like, what are we now facing as we look to move forward?
Well, I'd just make an observation that Donald Trump didn't run as a conventional Republican. He made it very clear that changes in Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security were off the table. He didn't, and highlighted frequently infrastructure and those sorts of things. I'm going to pivot to some political analysis for a second, because you kind of touched on it a little bit. I think what you're going to see in the data that comes out in this election is that Obama was able to plus up his support particularly among white, non-college educated, but also college educated versus Romney. And really what you saw is an underperformance by Mrs. Clinton in terms of turnout, and the Obama coalition, I think, is unique to Barack Obama. I mean, he's an historic figure. And so his support, particularly among minority groups, Asian, African American, Latino, really unique to him in terms of their turnout. And I think that's going to show in the data. And so, and Hillary Clinton was sort of uniquely incorrect for this moment of an anti-establishment. She doesn't get more establishment than Hillary Clinton. And then the contrast between her and Trump. So I think it's an interesting, Paul Ryan, let's say, if you see him as a conventional Republican, he couldn't have won that election last night. So it was not an endorsement of traditional Republican orthodoxy at all, by any stretch. In fact, it was a rejection of it. And so what you're going to see is, what is this new coalition of Trump voters, and what impact does it have? And the trend that you've seen over the last 20 years, in 25 years, is that the base constituencies of the major parties have flipped. And so in the Democratic Party, it's animated by higher incomes and higher education. 25, 30 years ago, those were traditional Republican constituencies. On the Republican side, and less church attendance. On the Republican side, you have lower income, lower education, and more church attendance. And which is one of the reasons why, think of the contrast between Mitt Romney. Some people refer to him as the boss that fired you. It doesn't get more Chamber of Commerce than Mitt Romney. And just 4 years later, Donald Trump, he doesn't get less Chamber of Commerce than Donald Trump. And so the base of the Republican Party, and this is the challenge for the Republicans, and the tension, and in this case, the blue collar side of the Republican Party beat the white collar wing. That's what happened here. And so the 47% that Romney referred to, there's a lot of Republicans in there, in that 47%. People who rely on government services, like transit. And so this is going to be fascinating to see. But I actually think it works, as you're trying to localize it. I actually think it works to transit's advantage, not disadvantage. I would say the opposite if this were a referendum on big government versus small government, and Trump was the vehicle for small government. That's not at all. That was not on the ballot yesterday, big versus small government. This was not an ideological decision. This was far more of a populist, cultural, economic, and a rejection of globalism in a lot of ways, in terms of the trade agreements and other things. So I actually think I would be optimistic if I were a port authority or a transit authority about the opportunities that are going to be coming out of Washington in the next 4 years. Not pessimistic.
Well, this is wonderful, Dave. Thanks so much for coming.
You bet.
Dan, excuse me.
All right.
For coming and sharing your thoughts. And I suspect you're going to be, like a lot of other people, doing a lot of research over the next few months, trying to understand exactly what did happen.
Well, we live in interesting times.
Yeah, there's no
There's
question.
no doubt about it.
I would encourage anybody who, I watched I think it was on Axis TV. It was one of those upper channels in Comcast called America Divided, The Rise of Trump, which I found fascinating. And it actually told me that Hillary Clinton was in trouble when I listened to that, kind of just the reactions. And so it gets back to a lot of what you're saying, Travis, in terms of kind of and this tracked all the way back to the Immigration Reform Act under Lyndon Johnson, which was kind of the basic premise of this. And so it was really fascinating, and I would encourage anybody to take a look at that just to understand some of the dynamics that are going on with the people. But I think we are going to be learning a lot over the next few months about what the election means and who is voting how, because I'm just curious and want to know.
Yeah, well, the pollsters are definitely going to be in the hot seat. Not getting too technical here, but most of the polling that was done, public polling was done, was based on the Obama coalition turnout models. And it's garbage in, garbage out when you do research of any sort. So this is all about the modeling. And what they didn't anticipate was a lower turnout of the traditional Obama coalition and a higher turnout of people who've either not been participating in the process or a lot of them, and there's no doubt there's a lot of Trump voters who'd voted for Barack Obama in the last two elections. I mean, which is sometimes hard to get your head around. But that's what makes, democracy fascinating.
Yep. Well, thanks again for coming. We could probably have this dialogue all day. So again, we'll look forward to hitting you back next year maybe and tell us what's changed as a result of the
You bet.
election.
Good luck.
Yep,
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really grateful.
You bet.
So Neil, we're a little bit behind, but you want to start
Well,
on the next?
yes, we'll work on making it up.
Okay.
So from the really big picture to, the TriMet picture. So I'd like to introduce Doug Kelsey and Alan Lato, who will come up here and begin to talk about the development of business plan. And I've had some initial conversations with you about this effort. And frankly, as you'll see, it's really an attempt to take some of our business processes that we've done in the past and begin to glue it together in a little bit more comprehensive picture. And I would say, D as well, sorry, D Brookshire, our CFO. I was convinced about the importance of this shortly after the board approved the payroll tax increase. And within the staff, I said, okay, we've got some money. Now let's increase service. And sometimes I got a deer in a headlight response, which meant that we had some disconnects within the organization related to all the needs that it takes related to actually increasing service, facilities, number of buses, number of operators, the training facilities, all the things that are necessary to scale an operation up. So that's certainly one reason, but there are a number of other, I think, complicating factors that Doug and Alan and Dee will go into, which really have to do with the aging of parts of our infrastructure and some of the changes in our infrastructure. So to a large extent, and the growth of the region. So we have a lot of things that sort of come together, and I think the business plan process is intended for us to really glue these things together. And I thought it was a great opportunity to also get the comments and thoughts and direction from the board related to our business writ large. So maybe with that, I'll be quiet and turn it over to the people who've really been focused on this, Doug, Alan, and Dee. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Neil. Good morning, everybody. I think as Dan referred to earlier, I think the Chinese cursor applies where may you live in interesting times, and here we are. But the dynamics of whether it be a federal election or other changes, I think there is a place for things like a business plan that we'll talk about that allow you to capture as a net to filter. We'll walk through some of the context of why business plans are important, and I suspect many of you have probably interacted with them yourselves over time. So what we wanted to do over the next period of time, as Neil's indicated, is to firstly and most importantly, through different parts of this discussion, solicit your feedback, your input, your direction, and hopefully your support at the end of this. So we're going to walk you through just a few slides here on sort of some context and process. There are a number of things we do here at TriMet very well today. So it's not as though a business plan is new and nothing's in place. There's a tremendous amount of discipline and structure that is already supporting a very successful legacy as a transit agency. We'll cover off some of the strategic premises as you start to build the plan up. We'll talk about the process we're going to go through, the timelines, and we'll also get into what we'll refer to as SWOT. Many of you have referred to strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and some of the dialogue you in fact just had allows us to capture some of that in as we build the pillars to get to what we ultimately want to deliver looking multiple years out, thus called the business plan. So again, part of this, embedded in this, again, is getting your very critically important direction and feedback as we go through this. So firstly, there's a lot of things we do. And I'm just going to back up for a sec here. So we already cover off financial forecasting and processes, financial budgets and processes as well. We have a service planning process, whether we're expanding, contracting, or adjusting. So those things are already embedded into the dynamics of the agency's success today. Underpinning that is the importance of, a lot of times we forget how much capital it takes to run not just the rolling stock or the products, but also the infrastructure behind this. We'll talk about this in a little bit further because this really becomes more and more important as systems like MAX over 30 years get to a different stage of not do you just run it on the first 30 years of service, now how do you rebuild the railway while you run on it every day? And there's a tremendous amount of complexity that goes with that responsibility. Again, part of our process that also captures today, I think Dan earlier had spoken about, the innovation side of things. Well, IT is a real instrument, not only behind the scenes, but the other services and products that we may look at today, but also in the future. And finally, things that we capture are really important are also Neil as the general manager, his priorities as he looks inside the organization, also inclusive with your direction in the priorities that you as a governing group may see as well. So the whole group is capturing a lot of those good things today. So if we're doing all that today, why would we look at a business plan? Well, a business plan does help us, and for those, if you go to a banker and you are operating a coffee shop or a dry cleaner, you kind of need a business plan to get money. And not only do small entrepreneurs and business people do that, having worked in a multinational, international oil company, we did it too. And so as a good practice, it allows you and forces you to start weaving together the different streams and trade-offs of priorities and also value and factor in risk. To help the agency be successful. So all the values that drive you to needed outcomes, not only on an annualized basis, but also on a multi-year basis. So in this case, we're looking at and suggesting a 5-year, but it's a rolling plan because, as we just learned last night, the conditions can change overnight. And so you want to update your plan on a rolling basis for new ingredients, new injects of information that can be material to the outcomes that you may need to alter course accordingly from a strategic perspective, not just a tactical perspective. So with this embeds the integrating and mapping the future, knowing that it will change, but you're trying to capture the discipline, the maturity, the sophistication of, if you look at just capital, for example, we would look at it over a 30-year or so horizon, and sometimes even further so, as we look at things like the Southwest Corridor. However, there are things where, say in IT, we maybe look over a 5-year period because its fundamental dynamics are far more fluid and changing all the time. So you got to change all the short, medium, and long-term integration issues with the daily services that we're obligated to provide. Part of it is also to align our external growth and our internal performance. Yes, there are naturally competing demands with limited resources and people. So again, trying to put it together into a documented, cohesive, openly public type of instrument that holds us accountable to delivering what we need to for the community who ultimately writes our checks. Why now? One of the things, as Neil referred to, is we're currently, with expansion, we're doing a comprehensive review of specific business units. Not so much the personnel in the units, but more of the activities. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But an example would be is we need a long-term maintenance program for the organization. Whether it be on the infrastructure side, whether it be on the IT side, and you can overlay the different modules. And again, you'll see that just coming up a little bit further. And I'll provide a few comments related to each. Also to help with clarity, focus, and alignment, it's really important also internally that how you run a $300 million business unit or an organization versus a $500 million one, let alone $1 billion to $2 billion, your conditions change internally, not only about the services you just add in, you need to rewire sometimes your processes, your practices, your structures to make sure you're ready to be successful, because you can't run it the same way, as I said, in a $100 million business unit, let alone $1 billion or plus growing business unit. So it's making sure we're capturing those things in our prioritization structure and ability to execute, or identifying areas where we've got gaps and what management plans to do about those. Balancing the growth and state of good repair. So we need to manage growth as well as managing an aging system, very natural. So some of our IT systems will not go for 30 years. Some may, but we need to have a conscious plan of when assets actually expire in timely basis and integrate all this, so as you take on more complexity and sophistication must go with the process. Again, prioritization and alignment of our strategies and our growth, because sometimes you have to make choices. Some things are more important than others, and not to say that you don't want to take care of them all, but you want to make sure as you project yourself out that you're focusing on the right things that will drive the right outcomes. So it forces a deeper forward-looking approach with these competing demands. Overall, the goal is to make sure that we manage risk, we manage opportunity, we manage pragmatism with the needed required outcomes, ultimately translating into trust for the public and ourselves. In discussion internally, we've identified probably 5 key areas of sort of key success areas that we need to build our corner posts around that we're proposing here with you today. 1, the customer, and secondly, financial, the people side of it, and we think a pretty important one that as agencies grow and shape, often when you move to state of good repair, particularly in capital-intensive environments, the innovation side of things and growth have to be balanced together. You don't want to lose that, as Dan talked about earlier, that we are seen as innovative, nimble, trusted, opportunistic, if you will. Often innovation is seen as a sign of health for an organization. And so TriMet has a wonderful legacy of innovation specifically, and we want to make sure that gets protected as, again, we grow to that $500 to billion plus structure of responsibilities. And finance, and also effectiveness. So part of it is how do we ensure we're productive? How do we ensure we're driving the right models for delivery, the right cost structures that are affordable and sustainable in the long time for all the different responsibilities that come with this? Now, one thing that's not in here that we think is really important, that in our original discussion, we had it as a separate discussion, that was safety. But in our debate, and it'd be interesting to solicit your thoughts on this, is we actually believe, because safety is not just a priority in this organization, it's a value. So part of it being a value is you will see safety as we get to the performance indicators embedded in every one of those. So we've not called it out on its own. We said it will be in every single one of those 5 because it is a value. Bringing the strategies together, there are a number of sub-strategies underway, as Neil referred to earlier at the opening here, that we need to further understand the obligations and the complexities that are coming with an aging network, all the responsibilities of expansion, where one just adds in an orange line or a new line, the Southwest Corridor. It has implications, not just for the build, but also for how do you put it into your culture, into your IT systems, and your people, your practices, your standard operating procedures, all the things that you do. So we are looking at our service expansion plans. We are looking at where do we need to be for the long term, not just today as we have expansion to plans to expand the bus system, eventually to the rail system. But you need the logistics behind it to support your ability to expand. Otherwise, it will have incremental cost impacts if we don't put the right facilities in the right place with the right aging facilities, and also, often that gets forgotten, the right equipment within those buildings. So there's a whole lot of dimension and complexity that comes with that. So we're working on a strategy right now to be part of that will be interdependent with where do we need to be with an information technology strategy. So we overlay that with where do we need to be longer term with a maintenance business plan. Where are the safety standards? Where do we stand up on all of those things? Where does our aging workforce fit into this? Where's the technology? And you go down the list of many dynamics that come with each. The organization also needs a store strategy. So one would think that's embedded in maintenance, but we shouldn't assume so. The organization will be to really understand applying technology and logistics and materials management practices to all of the above, facilities, network, services, etc. Another part of it is, an extension of it is also taking inventory and understanding the complexity of when are all these assets expiring. And often we get a pretty good picture on the big stuff, but some of the smaller mid stuff can often get forgotten in a growing, fast changing agency. Making sure we understand those assets and the interdependencies of when this asset expires, that maybe you should change it out at the same time, etc. And finally, and slightly out of order here, was a marketing plan is how do we want to reposition or position the TriMet brand? The hop card is a tremendous marketing opportunity. We'll refer to later as opportunities, if you will, wearing the marketing hat for a moment. Ellen came up with that, so he deserves the credit. Okay. So as you can see, part of this, as Dan talked about earlier, part of this is building the strategy of a business process here through your key premises. We're going to do an external scan. Last night was a great example of changing dynamics. In a past life, for example, when I was in the oil industry and used to do strategy work there, we used to call it protective nationalism or cooperative restructuring. This is at the international level. As governments change and ideologies change and importance changes, where are we positioning ourselves and what impacts may that in fact have on us that we need to factor into how TriMet needs to be successful in this case as a condition for the future. We'll talk about the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as we build on top of those key premises in external scan. And then we start to get into some very heavy lifting on the sub-strategies I've just referred to. And here's where the rubber hits the road is what are our top strategies on a 5-year forward-looking basis that we want to put our stake in the ground on? But if we get out 5 years from now and then look back, how do we know we're successful? So identifying those strategies, the measures, the goals that support each of those 5 corner posts that I referred to a little bit earlier in the presentation. Ultimately, all of this would culminate into an integrated business plan. And a key part of it would be our intention here would be iterative, because these things, as you have to make priorities, you need feedback. And part of this would also be public comment, and being external as the agency is, a really important piece here. Again, then it becomes a document, a process that we all hold ourselves accountable to going forward. Timelines, and intention today is to review the concept, hopefully obtain your support and factor in any adjustments or comments you may have. The initial draft would be out in September, probably the latter part of February, excuse me. Public input available through March. Then we would need to finally reconcile the strategies with our resources of what I'll call people and dollars, and culminating in spring. And then that would helpfully inform the final annual budget process. The intent would be it would fit into the board approval process, which typically shows up in May, and this is where we launching our initial first inaugural business plan. Often when you put a new business plan in place, it may take a couple iterations over a couple years to kind of get the dust settled and such. So intention would be a bit of a learning process for us until it's all comfortable and settled. Oops, sorry about that. So I'm going to now turn it over to D. Oh, why is it moving quick here?
Anybody have any questions or comments for Doug before we move forward? Okay.
Okay, thanks. Turn over to D to talk about some of the strategic premises, the financial premises.
Okay, so there's really nothing new here. What we're talking about is building on our strategic financial plan guidelines. So I thought I'd go through them rather quickly, but answer any questions that you might have. You may recall that earlier this year, before we adopted the fiscal year 17 budget, we went through how the budget aligned with our strategic financial plans, and at that point we were in line with every one of them. So the first one, of course, is the priority for the use of increased revenues from payroll tax resulting from increased regional employment growth. This one is focused on calculating the expected base increase and adding that to the expected increase in passenger revenue, and then taking a look, comparing that with the cost of the new service in the budget, and then seeing where we lie. And as it turned out, we are dedicating 89% in fiscal year 17 to new service. So the second one is current service costs should not grow faster than general inflation. We struggled with this one for a while because the inflation is much lower right now than our expected growth in our budget, but by comparing budget to budget, we actually found that we were within the regional growth CPI 1.73. We landed at 1.3% of that. The third one, TriMet should always maintain appropriate financial reserves consistent with TriMet's fund balance. Our projections are well within the 2.5 times the monthly operating cost that requires. Fare policies should strive to balance growth in ridership and passenger revenue, improve customer experience, mitigate costs for low-income transit-dependent riders. Our budget has a list of those that meet that demand. The next one is capital assets must be properly maintained and replaced. We have a capital improvement program that exceeds $130 million. That's net of the PMLR costs. The use of debt should be minimized and never exceed TriMet's debt policy. You may recall the debt policy does require that the debt service on senior lien, payroll tax, and leases payments should remain below 6% of continuing revenues. We're at 4.5% in the fiscal year 17 budget. And the last one is that within 15 years, pension trust should be fully funded and other post-employment benefits, or OPEB, liability reduced by 50%. In July of 2014, the board established this particular at the strategic financial plan guidelines. We're now in the 13th year of the closed plan, so currently the union plan is 75% funded, and the management staff plan is now 86% funded. Once the pensions are fully funded, the same stream of income funding should be dedicated to OPEB funding until the OPEB liability is fully funded. We're still on track to do that. So the next part of my piece of this presentation relates to the financial forecast and the 5-year projections. In taking a forward look at the financial forecast tables themselves, that shows that growing payroll tax revenues are expected over time. We have service expansion planned in every year to meet the expected growth. We have moderate expense growth. Over time, we're limiting our M&S growth to 1% per year. The growing debt capacity is going to be maintained within our current limit of 6%. And accelerating capital needs, it does show accelerating capital needs over time. We expect that to actually amp up just a bit once our asset management planning is completed. So now I'll turn it over to Alan to move into the service expansion part.
Great, thanks, Dee. I've given presentations to you a number of times about the service enhancement plan, so I won't go too far into it, but as the quick reminder, these are the visions for future service that we've developed with neighborhoods, with our riders, with business associations, cities, counties, basically every stakeholder who wanted to and had interest or would put up with talking with us about what their needs and desires were in the future. And so that helps set the sort of the route map of where we look to increase service over time. The other part is looking at the growth in the region, looking at the expectations of growth in meeting the sort of the shared expectations for transportation in the regional transportation plan. That requires something on the average of 2.1% increases in actual transit service each year over the course of the years. And so we, in the structure of what Dee was just talking about in terms of the budget, we are able to meet or actually somewhat exceed that during the next 9 years, 8.5, 9 years of the payroll tax increment growth. And so able to meet those expectations and be able to fulfill step by step towards that vision. The vision goes well beyond that, so we won't be able to, as I've explained before, not be able to do all of the SEPs in 10 years, but we can make a big move towards those. The base growth then of the payroll tax and other resources would pay for the reliability needs. That is, as congestion grows, we need to add time to our schedules so that our buses still arrive on time as people expect. And part of the capacity needs on lines that already exist and peak of the peak are getting overfilled as we add additional service to handle those kinds of capacity needs. So as we started off earlier on talking about, the series of things that we need to focus on to develop a business plan that forces us and helps us set priorities and focus in on the action steps we need to take. The beginning, the first start of that is what are the service needs, and then what are all the needs that tumble on from that. Once we understand service needs, that tells us how many buses we need, that helps us understand what our facilities needs are, what our maintenance needs are, and all the way down through. So this is just kind of a quick overview of the service needs and the expectation that we will be able to continue to expand service each year as we have for the past few years. With that, maybe I'll pause for a second, see if there are any questions on that.
That's good.
As we talk about the service expansion, made a note to myself, how will this review incorporate and coordinate with the work that's going on with the regional transit plan that's under development?
Yeah.
And how will that get reflected back in our business plan? And then, and the other part of that is the climate smart communities report. Both of which are going to rely very heavily on transit.
Absolutely. So both of those, my staff is working with Metro staff and other jurisdictions to make sure that those things align. The regional transit strategy, which is part of the regional transit plan, specifically picks up our service enhancement plans and Wilsonville's plans and the small agencies' plans and pulls that together, better quantifies them and puts them in the language of the regional transportation plan. Also sets out a service enhancement, service expansion policy that the region can look at in terms of any new additional projects beyond the ones that we're talking about today. So those are really tightly integrated, and the region, Metro, and the cities and counties look very much to our service enhancement plan public process that we've already done and continue each year as the foundation for developing that.
Okay, and that also then leads the question is, how are we keeping our service enhancement plans fresh? And you kind of touched
right.
on
So maybe to say that a little bit more directly, the service enhancement plans is sort of the route map of where we go. But each year we have to make these key decisions on which element are we gonna, which step are we gonna take next. And so that's our annual service plan, which I've presented to you all before, where we are starting, actually, we've already started in terms of connecting with our stakeholders, with neighborhoods, with the groups that really we know want to stay involved to identify what the priorities might be. We will be going out to the public very soon with an initial thought of what the improvements might be for FY18, and then come back after we've gathered whatever feedback we get with a refined proposal in the new year. so that each year we do that kind of a process to gather more understanding of what the need is and more input from our stakeholders to understand what they're seeing as their need, so that it does stay fresh. What the investments that we make each year are very much up to the date.
Okay. And also thinking about freshness and looking at UD, with the strategic finance plan, some of what Doug was saying in terms of, the business plan is new and takes a couple of years to work it through before you get it right. And that was certainly our thought as we put together the strategic finance plan. This was adopted
July of 2014.
so 2 years ago.
Right.
How well is this fitting? And do we need to go back and look at it again and freshen it up?
Very good point. We actually did a little bit of work on that in this last year, and we modified the way that the methodology we were using to calculate one of them. And so we brought you updates from time to time on the OPEB. We do need to revisit that, and that is something we will be doing in this next budget process.
So that'll be as we look at the forecast.
It will be. There's going to be some pressure clearly on the 6%, maintaining the debt policy at 6% as we better understand all of our capital needs going forward. So we're keeping a very close eye on that. We're running a variety of scenarios on what that means in terms of additional capacity. So, and we'll bring that to you.
Okay.
If there's nothing else, then I think that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Is it timely for me to
Yeah, I
ask?
thought you were answering some question more, but
I have actually a general kind of a business plan question, which is how do you propose to keep this plan as something that just doesn't sit on the shelf? How do we propose to measure ourselves against it? And certainly for the financial plan in the budget process, we hear about that, and service enhancement plan same. But asset management, for example, how do we use this plan as a resource going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of the once we get the business plan in place, part of it would be to actually report out on the business plan. Underneath each of those categories, customer, financial effectiveness, we would have some documented strategies and measures that we're going to have to develop. So how are we doing in each respective strategy to the plan that we would all sign up for? So there would be a reporting back on our progress on an appropriately determined basis, determine where we sit, what's successful, what adjustments we're making, areas maybe we're under successful or not successful, we got to shore up. So that'd be the asset management piece. It's going to take us about a year plus so it's running a little bit longer. We're still in the process through Dee's team's good work, actually developing the asset management program. So the intention in the first round, this is probably where it takes a couple of years to kind of take all those working elements together. So asset management would articulate what ones should we be replacing and in what order, based on our affordability or resource, the risk profile of some of those assets. That would then get embodied into some of the strategies that we actually need to deliver out top. So asset management will be one component of many of those elements that it would be articulated in the strategy itself. So we'll have to make adjustments as we go, but we're still in the inventory collection stage around what is it, where are all our assets, because we don't know where they all are in terms of their stage of age and interdependency to other ones. So we're still developing that base, if you will. And that's why it'll take probably a couple of years to get there. Then we'll have to apply that to the affordability, and that's where Dee talks about the debt servicing 6% and such. We may have to make course corrections while we go to we may have certain periods of time where some assets have just got to get done because of it's served its life cycle and it's got to be replaced. So all of that gets factored into the game plan or the business plan on an annualized basis. But we'd look at it on a 5-year rolling basis, because sometimes in your asset plan you may have assets you've articulated, you think it may be in year 3, but a condition of that asset may have changed where you need to accelerate up and you need to move on it now. So it'll be fairly dynamic, but all those will be captured in the outcomes of the needed business plan.
If I just might add to that is that, and Dee can elaborate, but of course we're full throttle right now on beginning the process of meeting a whole new series of federal guidelines regarding asset management and state of good repair, which has been their initiative. And the result of that, at the end of the process, which is due to FTA in 2018, if I recall, is actually a rating of all of our assets on a scale of 1 to 5, 3 being okay. So we'll know, both in terms of a global measure as well as in specific categories of assets or specific assets in certain cases, what the state of good repair rating, if you will, are for our various key points. So that will be a really important new tool. I've often told our friends at the federal government that those regulations came just in time for TriMet, because at this stage of our life, we really need that. And so it's a very good thing. But elaborate a tad on that.
If I might add that this is another district-wide project, that is consolidating and pulling together a number of existing tracking methods that we have had for a number of years. And so this pulls it all into one place, it puts it under the same lens, and it will inform both our operating budget and our capital budget, and that's how the information will come to you, if not in a separate report as an update or on the capital asset management plan itself. You will see the results of the asset management planning process in the capital budget as well as the operating budget.
That's helpful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
One of the other things I've been interested in making sure that this agency keeps in mind is the issues related to earthquake preparedness, and particularly as you were talking about the asset management plan. I'm wondering if the answer is it doesn't yet, is there a way to build that into the business plan, not as a separate element? I really kind of see it as related to the safety thing, that's something that is part of all of our processes. Because, and I see two components, and overlapping components. One is for the safety and security of our facilities for our employees and our equipment housed in various facilities, that type of thing. But the second, and very important, is how would we provide service assuming a major event happens? And obviously we're not going to be providing the same level of service as we are right now, but how quickly can we recover, and how would that be reflected in this kind of work? So.
Maybe if I could comment to that. That's a really good point. Once Ellen was going to walk us through a little bit later the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and you'll actually see in the ones we'll put forward to you, it actually starts to get captured in our weaknesses, threats, and opportunities. Actually, probably all of the above in that. But you're quite right. That's where the resiliency of the organization, whether it be pandemics through to earthquakes, so it's part of resiliency as a broader topic. And there are a lot of practices that are already in place in the agency today. Probably, are we ready? Probably not. But you're never probably fully ready. But you have to keep building your muscle in this area. And I think that's one of the areas that we envision will show up in our strategies and our emphasis over. It's probably not a one-year wonder to say, let's focus just on resiliency. It's cultural, I think, and we have to work with and we're well embedded already with our regional partners. And so part of it is making sure we're embedded there. We have the right command structures, we have the right infrastructure, we have the right cultures, including home preparedness. So part of that will all be part, I suspect, that'll emerge out of our strategic priorities. And again, based on comments like this, would be very helpful.
And maybe just to add one concrete example, we're working with the city of Portland that's working on a transportation recovery plan for after a large seismic event. Obviously, our part is, well, how does transit work for that? It's a first step, but it's an important one.
So I have just a comment, and kind of a first question, I guess. First off, I'm looking forward to see what you come up with and how you integrate all of this together in something that's a cohesive, understandable, and simple enough plan that we can all use. Gets back to tying together some of your things. The thing I want you to think about is, if I look at our website in terms of our values, I think we have a one sentence, we do the right thing, we are inclusive, and I can't remember what it was, customer service, accountability, or whatever we have there. But the reason I bring it up is you mentioned safety. I didn't see safety in that, and so I look at some key values that are pretty important in terms of directing our business plan. So safety is a big one, and obviously we need to have, you give us a lot of information on safety, but clearly we need some simple key metrics that we can judge at how we're doing on the business plan.
Yeah.
I look at diversity or inclusiveness. We've had a large discussion about that. Seems like almost every time we talk about contracting, but that's diversity in terms of our contracting, but it's also our workforce. And so the question is, I'm wondering if we need to take a look at the values a little bit more to bring out some of those key things that I think are important to the board. And I just popped out two of them that come to mind, but innovation's another one. What does that mean? And I'd love to understand how we know if we're successful in those, so we're heading the right way. If you follow my...
Yeah, very much.
Okay.
I think this is actually very helpful comments and guidance, particularly on the value side. At the front end, when we looked at the vision, the mission, and values, we assumed, and this is again part of this discussion, it was relatively intact. But if part of the feedback is to go back and look specifically at our values, I think we can do so as well to make sure we're captured.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah,
We might
yeah.
want to have a little more robust discussion of that to make sure we're focusing on the priority issues, because obviously safety is a big issue, and we want to make sure, as you said, that's embedded in everything we do, right? It's not an afterthought that you check the box. Same way with diversity.
Correct.
It's not that when you're done, you check the box and say, I've done that. It needs to be part of the culture of the organization right up front. And ultimately, I hope this business plan helps us get to that.
Correct. Yeah, I think to your points, that you'll see, and if we go back to those 5 I had listed up earlier, the people effectiveness. So under the people side, that's where the diversity as one of the strategies
Exactly.
would fall out under the category called people, and we would actually establish metrics around how do we know we're successful.
Yeah.
And safety would have
Perfect.
in
Yep.
each of those subcategories as well as one that's embedded throughout all of them.
You got that. And really do think about the simple metrics. I mean, we can get
Yeah.
completely carried away. I would love to see us have, a couple handfuls of metrics that are really important to us that we can look at and say we're heading the right way, rather than trying to, do a 3-page report on safety as an example.
Correct. Yeah, the intention hopefully be as part of this is as we learn through implementing this is actually a bit of a simple dashboard. If one follows the authors of Balanced Scorecard from Kaplan Norton, sort of the inventors of this, it's simple dashboards. You want 26 to 28 kind of metrics generally that will be embedded in this and how we report back in each of those, because to your point, it's very well taken. You can blow your brains out by having so many metrics that you want to make sure you've got the right strategic ones. Then each department would have their sub ones that help contribute to it on the way up.
Yep.
So people aren't misaligned; they're actually aligned. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great points. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move through, if we can, into the strategic premises, and Ellen's going to help us through that next piece.
Great. There is actually a single-page handout that provides the details to that that looks like this, just one side. And obviously the premises for any fairly comprehensive business plan can extend a long way. What we've tried to do is boil it down to the basics. And these are premises or basic assumptions in thinking about how we approach this. You've already heard some of the financially focused ones from Dee, and this just covers some of the others. So I'm going to quickly run through this. In terms of the agency, we already mentioned the vision, mission, values, which is the exact wording is in the very last page of your presentation in front of you, just for reference. And looking at that as continuing, though we can definitely take direction from President Warner and take a look at that and see what needs to be refreshed in there. To emphasize that TriMet will maintain and strengthen its culture of safety so that it runs throughout what we do. It's always a part of everything we do. and that there's generally no substantial change to TriMet governance and budgeting processes, that we're heading generally in the right direction, that what we're trying to do is refine and improve, not substantially rebuild. In terms of requirements, maybe obviously, but we want to clearly state TriMet will meet or exceed all regulatory obligations at the federal, state, and local levels. All of our proposed actions would be informed by the need to ensure cost effectiveness and risk mitigation. In terms of growth, and this gets back to the service needs that I was talking about earlier, the population and employment growth, as you probably know, has been pretty robust in this region. Population growth was robust even when unemployment was really high. And so we are assuming that that kind of robust growth continues for the entire period and probably beyond of the business plan. And thus the service needs are to continue to grow on average each year and make a substantial improvement in the service over time. The economy, the regional growth will continue, and that fuel and energy prices will stay relatively stable. That doesn't mean they won't grow a little bit, but they won't dramatically bounce up and down. And that unemployment rates, again, will stay relatively stable, not bounce up and down too much. In terms of financial, I think you heard most of these, so I'll just summarize. No additional major funding source beyond those that are already identified are assumed in any of these, especially for a 5-year. We're trying to make sure that we line up with existing identified resources. The state of good repair needs continue as the system ages, as Doug was talking about, and the need grows. In terms of service, we need to keep that in a very good state of repair to maintain safety and service. That federal and state funding and oversight will remain relatively constant. Obviously, as we mentioned, this is an annual plan. If anything changes at the federal level, then we'll be able to reflect that as we go forward. TriMet will work to maintain its excellent bond rating, and that those strategic financial plan elements that Dee summarized will remain in place, and we'll still continue looking towards those. In service and ridership will grow, and TriMet will continue to put a focus on-time performance with the success that we've had in the rail and starting to focus in again on bus, while still, again, maintaining that culture of safety so that everything we're doing continues to reflect that. Those are all sort of basic assumptions behind it. You know, the Earth isn't going to shift so dramatically that we have to make giant changes this year is the assumption for the next 5 years. The vehicle technology is looking at what we're assuming in terms of dealing with our fleet. So right now we operate mostly 40-foot buses. We will expect to add articulated 60-foot buses for the Division BRT HCT project. We don't have specific plans to do more than that, but that's certainly something that we could look at in the future. For right now, the 5-year projections assume continuing mostly with a 40-foot fleet. As I think you all remember, we recently were awarded a grant to purchase 4 to 5 electric buses, and we'll be able to get those in a couple of years and run them, test them, see how well they do, and start to test this assumption that we're starting to make that at some point when the business case is there, we start to shift more substantially towards an electric fleet. And then automated vehicle technology, which obviously is very big in the news and very big at transit conferences right now, will of course move forward and of course start to be available on the market, but won't so dramatically shift things in the next 5 years that we need to make a lot of changes based on that. One of the things that is flagged here is the ability to start to use some of the AV-related technology for safety, like the Mobileye technology that we're going to start testing on our Lyft paratransit buses sometime early next year. So that's the general overview. As Doug said, we'll get to the SWOT list fairly soon, so there will be some other things that are on there that get to things that we haven't touched on here. I wanted to pause and see if there are other big issues or assumptions, or if you want to test any of these. Are there things that either you want to add or don't feel quite right here, or is this does this generally make sense?
I guess one thing I don't see, and I'm not sure if it belongs here, is not only changes in technology that the agency might use, but changes in transportation technology that others are using that could impact us. Autonomous vehicles
And you'll
are
see,
on the way,
yeah.
you know, and individuals using those perhaps instead of using transit.
You'll see that reflected in the SWOT list, both as an opportunity and as a threat.
Okay.
So we can talk about that a little bit, but certainly with the recent tests that just started of Uber running automated vehicles in Pittsburgh, there are things coming down the line in terms of cars being on the market that are available for the general public. Manufacturers have announced they're going to start putting those on the market anytime between 2018 and 2021, depending on the. So we're kind of at the out years of the 5-year, starting to think about it, but we'll need to refresh that each year.
Right.
I can maybe just comment to this as well. I mean, with technology, I think most of us all know that it's how far do we want to be in the leading side of technology and the shaping side, because there's significant investment of limited resources and such. So I think you'll see this starting to emerge, and we haven't got there yet, of course. It's part of what we're trying to build is in the strategy of to where do we put, on what topics do we want to push, be it the front end of innovation or the mid-range or the back end of innovation on some topics. The automated vehicles is a great example of where do we want to position ourselves in our relationship to as an agency, but also to the broader community as well. So I think you'll start to see that emerge as some of our strategies around one of those corner pieces around innovation and growth. And so without losing it, saying, well, we'll only pick it up once it's a stable technology. I think part of the intent might be is we want to kind of play in that field a little bit, because we can maybe help. This is a great sized agency. There's a great culture in here that is innovative, and let's, the intent not to lose that, but not distract us also in the balance from delivering those core services really well every day. So I think those examples will show up in our strategy on which ones do we want to pick and focus on.
So, as I look at the information that we have here, which I think is a great foundation for the process of moving through the strategic business plan that we're talking about, and Alan, you just referenced, in your your final statement, you said, are there things that we'd like to see? Are we on the right track? Well, there's a little bit of a challenge to understanding whether or not we're on the right track and understanding exactly what our stakeholders, riders, and folks are looking for. And I'm going to hearken a little bit back to what Dan was talking about earlier. And I think some of the shock that we're seeing this morning as far as the election results, in that, as I look at these things and I look at these items, we look out over the next 5 years, I'm thinking in terms of, what are the things we don't know at this point? Hence, the underpinning of, I think, what just occurred nationally, because we didn't have the foresight. In some instances, we feel like everything's going great. We do. We've got an amazing bond rating. We've got, a lot of great things that are going on. But as I look at this, I listen and I watch and see what just occurred nationally. I do start to wonder, are we basically proverbially drinking our own Kool-Aid to some degree? And are we doing a deep enough dive to truly understand the sentiment of our stakeholders, our riders, the folks that, the broader community, to ensure that the things that, because as we, similar to the strategic financial plan, once we launch this, I think our overall focus has always been, we'll do some updates, but if we're changing it too rapidly and too often, it really doesn't. It's really not giving us the clear direction that we need or want, or I think we'll be able to deliver on, because we put things in motion, and some of those things are more longer term. So it's less of a question, more of a comment or a statement, to the degree of making sure we do have some mechanism as we launch this process to truly see if we can't grab a full understanding of the sentiment that underlies, again, what just occurred nationally, is something that sends me a little bit of a pause and caution to say, do we truly understand all the facets, or enough of the facets, that we can make this plan move it forward, and in 5 years ultimately be achieving what our stakeholders and riders and the broader community want from us?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think part of this, the intention of our process is to make sure we have, I'll call the scan, as you saw earlier, that to minimize our blind spots. So we don't get captured on not having resiliency factored into what are those things that takes us, all of us, to put the right thoughts together. We're not missing something that leaves us vulnerable, and we don't have a respective plan for in a conscious ranking of where it's part of importance and funding. So I think from the public perspective, the hope would be it's captured at that SWOT level to start with, and we say, okay, how material is this, or do we have any other blind spots that we're not factoring in? And that would be part of the intended ongoing process of new ones, that not to just set it in place, to your point, for 5 years and sort of set it and forget it, as people say, but you do adapt to, is there a new change that we haven't factored in year 2 that we thought we had captured reasonably well in year 1? So the intention to be receptive and open and to capture some of those potential blind spots. And part of the learning may be is that as we continue to focus on one of those key categories called the customer, we may have to look at those other outside stakeholder and customer type of inputs, maybe even earlier on in our process, not necessarily at the back end when we think we've got the plan at the final stages. So I think hopefully we can capture that, and maybe there's 2 parts we have to look at this, not just one. Yeah, good point.
I think I'd add that that's a very good caution, and as Doug said, part of the reason why you do a SWOT is to sort of look around for those kinds of things. I should also say, we kind of hinted at it, but maybe didn't say it quite specifically enough. Our annual service plan, where we're going back out each year and talking to people about what they need, our budget process, where we're getting input, and this business plan all come like dovetail together. And are aligned in terms of timing and in terms of outcomes. So they're supposed to reflect and inform each other. So that's another sort of step in the road of making sure that we're not just in an echo chamber listening to ourselves, we're listening to others and developing this as well.
Well, can I have a follow-up?
Of course you can.
And I understand. I mean, we've seen a lot of the reports, all the data. And so I'm recommending, and it's not even a well-formed recommendation, because I don't have any potential solutions of what I'm trying to communicate here. But ultimately, what I feel like I just perceived on a national basis was, if anybody saw this coming, that we would have effectively done something differently. I think along the way. Nobody saw that. No, I shouldn't say nobody saw it coming, because there's been some polls and things. But at this point, for the most part, we've got low unemployment. We've got one of the highest stock markets we've seen in history. All of these things appear to be positives, but we just saw a dramatic divergence from kind of the politically correct historical norms of how we elect leaders in the country. And so if that occurs there, with all of the investment that they put in, all of the data gathering and collection that they do at that level, all I'm saying is that at some point, if we continue to do and collect the same data from in the same mechanisms, we're going to get similar responses. And I'm encouraging us to, is there and are there other opportunities for us to do something innovative in just the whole data collection, stakeholder review, that potentially could give us some additional data or insight that we just don't see at this point.
I might note that one of our tools for that has been this
It's right there.
which is our annual attitude and awareness survey, and I think what we can do is use that as one tool And Bernie also has, as you know, some other research that is ready to be queued up. And so part of it is I think we have to use all of our tools of sort of assessing where our public and our writers and our stakeholders are. So it's all the antenna need to be out and then brought back. And you're a very important part of that because you're out in the community, you're dealing with your business associates, others, community groups, neighborhoods, all really important to sort of bring back to this. So I think what this can do is provide us some focus and ask us to all make those assessments again and again and again with the various layers of research that we do. And we do a lot related to that. It may not be enough to catch everything, but hopefully there's enough that we can really embellish your concern and really pay some close attention to it as we move through this. I'd also suspect that the iterative nature of this is important in that regard, and that we start one year and we can learn from the reactions and begin to really use the annual process to really begin to study, do we need to make an adjustment along the way?
Well, this is a great point, and we need to do two things. One is to analyze the data, and the other is to analyze how we're getting the data about what the public and our ridership thinks, and be constantly challenging ourselves to understand, are we really getting at what the public and the ridership are telling us. Just to embellish a little bit on what Neil said, we are doing some new things that we haven't done before. We've got the Attitude and Awareness Survey, which we do every year, and we continually look for new questions and new ways to ask old questions so that we're trying to get at what people really are thinking. We're also doing, last year we initiated a new onboard survey process where we use basically iPads, and we're getting much more response from folks, and we can do a much more sort of interactive set of questions than the old paper questions. And we're asking very specifically about things like Lyft and Uber. Are you riding Lyft and Uber more? Are you riding transit less as a result of using those systems more? We're also employing our Riders Club as a sounding board for issues that come up for us. What are you hearing? And we're also mining the social media interactions that our staff have to try to identify themes that we're starting to hear more about, and then use that as a way to formulate additional surveys that go out. So it's a great point. We are learning a lot more about that just over the last year and trying more things.
One last follow-up with that, and part of this is driven by the the decrease in ridership that we've experienced over the last year. I mean, we've kept our rates stable for, I think, going on 5 years now. We haven't raised our rates, and we've actually done some things that have enhanced it. I mean, we went to a 2.5 hour transfer. We've lowered some other rates and raised the honored citizens fare a little bit. So we've done things that have encouraged that. And we've hinted that this could be potentially based on the low cost of fuel that could be contributing to this. But it's that type of thing that really kind of raises the flag to say, what is it? I mean, we've literally done some things that should have encouraged more ridership rather than less. And it's those types of things that really that drive home and complete my question and concern as to what can we make sure that we include in this business plan that essentially gets us on that path to being a incredibly valued resource, to the degree that they see our folks, our stakeholders, our riders see us as an essential component. And again, I've written a lot of business plans in my career, and you never have all the information. The plan's only as good as the day you implement it. But ultimately, a plan that changes too often is really not a good plan. Mm-hmm. And so if we miss something so critical as to how do we get our ridership to where it needs to be in 5 years, and then 10 years, and then 15 years, and climate smart communities, then you don't get a redo if you get too far behind that curve.
Maybe I'll just comment to that. I mean, one of the things, and we'll sort of a couple sections later in this presentation, once we get to the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, under the threats area, because part of this is about those blind spots, those threats, is identifying that, but also over time developing a risk registry as an instrument that says, what are those threats? What are the risks to the agency, or the blind spots, if you will, and what does the agency and management need plans to do about it? And so, and each one of those may have a different subcourse of action if they're significant enough, and in the threat side, that they become part of our strategy for us to reduce that risk or eliminate the risk or use it as an opportunity in the future. So we minimize the, 5 years ago, what happened, or a surprise. So again, it's always having that, as Neil talked about, the antenna up, always be scanning, but embedding those threats into not just identifying it's a list, but what are some of those key ones that have to turn into actions by management to try and minimize that, so it ends up in your part of your core deliverables of your strategy to make sure the ship is right-sized, if you will, if it's truly a significant one. The one you identify is, I think, is a very good one, because loss of ridership is related to loss of revenue, which flows right through to the bottom line, right? So that cuts through all the language of going, okay, well, that's less financial oxygen available to the organization to deploy these other strategies. So to me, that's a very significant type of threat that management will probably have to identify and develop strategies around. So the goal is to minimize surprises on the big strategic game, and part of this is that process is, with business plans, you try and capture everything you possibly can with the widest net to start with, and say, okay, which ones are the hills to focus on. So,
Thank you.
And
great points.
I want to follow up a little bit of what you talked about, Lori, which is kind of technology and just kind of the systems out there. I want TriMet to be on, innovators in a big way, and looking to the future. And even though our ridership is down a bit, I know we're having huge crush problems on many of our lines, and I'm on those on a regular basis. So just like our road system, where it's being filled up in peak hours, both directions on some roads, I believe that the region is probably going to start looking at ways to encourage, by pricing or other ways, to spread that load out. And I just want us to be thinking about that, both in terms of the infrastructure, because I think everybody realizes now you can add lanes, but unless you do something to actually control the growth, they're going to get filled up with commuters, and it's you're going to have the same problem again. So the question is, what kind of things could we do? This is just me thinking out loud with you, in terms of pricing or other things, to to level out our load some. And I'm looking at research on a nationwide, worldwide basis, maybe. I just want us to be, some of the preeminent experts in how to help the region get to that stuff. And so I'm hoping that the business plan actually has some component that gets to those kind of things, in terms of innovation, technology, and all those things.
I think these are excellent points. I think one of the tools that are available to us right now is this card.
Yep.
Because once we know our customers better, then you can start doing peak, off-peak pricing, because it's sure a lot cheaper to manage the demand through pricing than it is for throwing big capital at it. You're not building the network to the highest peak of the day for all that infrastructure. So cost avoidance could be a big thing, and it's sometimes worth it to manage those peaks, to exactly your point. So I think that is one of the instruments that are available to us in dynamic pricing, as maybe we have to look at pricing in a very different way than sort of typical every X number of years it changes, but you move more to dynamic pricing. Again, we used to do this in the oil industry. We changed pump prices 5 times a day per service station. And so it's more of a natural market like airlines do, and you're getting to yield management instruments a bit rather than sort of a utility-based type of approaching structure. So I think there are opportunities in there for sure.
So I'm saying, as part of our business plan, that needs to be one of our, if innovation is one of our key values and things we want to look at. That's just an example.
It's a great one.
Of things we should look at.
Okay.
And Bruce, maybe
Great feedback.
if I can follow up, I think I also heard very broadly congestion in the region.
Yeah.
What role can we play in terms of traffic congestion?
Because
demand
we're stuck in it.
times? Yeah.
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 Okay.
So that's excellent feedback. Is exactly what we're trying to elicit from you today. So that's helpful. Thank you. If there aren't any more questions on this section, I'd like to move quickly through over the next sort of 3 to 4 minutes, just on give you a quick overview, and I'll move through this quickly. Just on some of the sub-strategies that we're working on that will be quite foundational to help us build this plan. Often, typically, you'd have some of these in place before you built the business plan, but this is part of this multi-year approach. We're trying to do both ends of the barbell at the same time, a little bit, if you will. So you've talked about safety here quite significantly, and it makes a lot of sense. I'm just going to move through a couple. Here we go. So part of our plan is, and we're required by the federal regulations to have a safety management system plan. So we are a part of doing that. And Harry is leading the charge on that for the organization. So that will help us. Safety management systems typically are very cultural. It takes a number of years to get them embedded, not just the documentation, but the cultural elements of a system safety plan, which integrates your snow plans and all the technical elements. They all come together as part of your safety program. So part of that we're trying to identify is how do we leverage and expand the safety culture, not just accept it where we are today, which has got lots of wonderful things going on. Again, it's an FDA requirement. Part of a safety management system is that also will be a requirement that the board will need to adopt this formally. So that will be coming your way probably in the new year at some point in time. It'll be a separate update on getting that through. Under the facilities network strategy, what we're trying to do here is match supply and demand for the vehicles and service, including expansion, making sure our logistics match with not just grow the business, but how do you support it to ensure successful, and it's done in a cost-effective way. For example, so we're not sending buses from the west side of the river over to the east side because that's where the service plans are. You want to have the right places and the right locations with the right delivery and the right models, and minimize the investment you actually have to do all that. Again, cost-effective alternatives. There's different ways to deliver this. Do you own land? Do you lease it? There's different models of how you execute those, and how do you take advantage of scale at the right time as well, rather than having many little sub-units all over the place, because you're overlaying different admin costs that go, overheads, if you will, that go with that. Maintenance, again, 15-year time frame. Again, what we're looking to put in here, what resources are needed? What fleet? We have different types of fleet and aging at different stages, and we also have different performance levels related to each fleet. For example, the Type 1 cars are, we have challenges on the Type 1 cars in terms of what's called their mean distance between their failures. So at some point, that car will sunset out, and as you see in our capital plans, we'll have to overlay the new technology and the new type of vehicle. So you want to do that at the right time, so the vehicles aren't, you have to bring in the new vehicles while you run the old vehicles, so you need a place to put those. So all those little details are what management has to make sure we're capturing so we can deliver accordingly. Compliance and expansion requirements, really important. Often it's a lot of these, when you're running a railroad and you're running your fleet obligations, you've got to make sure you're adhering to the regulations and the policies that we put in place. That becomes very important, and different ways to do it. Stores and inventory management, again, the whole materials management, logistics, labor efficiency. How do we leapfrog and use technology in some of our top practices? That typically takes quite a bit of time, from managing the inventories, knowing where they are, the sign-ins, the sign-outs, and leveraging technology to do so. That takes resources, that takes time. While you run parallel systems, you don't just stop one system then put the new one in place. You run them parallel till the new one's proven itself. Again, also in this area, leveraging strategic relationships. Are there other models and ways to deliver some of these services that we haven't really contemplated in the past, from some of our strategic partnerships that may be in place now and in the future? Don't know. I think we have to be open to some of that. Asset management plan, we've spoken a bit about that. Again, look, the FDA requirement, as Neil's referred to, 2018, that's a requirement. We're well on our way. We will meet that. But with that will become a lot of insights that the agency will have to embed in its prioritization, its funding, and its ability to implement all these upgrades, changes, and programs together. while you run an existing railway. It's in some regard just how do you rebuild your car, as a metaphor, while you drive it. You don't get to park it and do it. You got to manage all that at the same time. The IT strategic plan, again, 5-year period, integrated, crucial to integrate it with all the other sub-strategies that are going on your business. It really wires or wirelesses everything together, depending on the technology we use. We need to also validate what is our strategic platform going to be for that next generation. So we find out where to what degree do you go to the cloud, et cetera, and what are the risks and the cyber, ensure you've got your cyber protections and such in place to go with that. And part of IT also is to take advantage of best practices and pursue that targeted, and the key word's targeted innovation. So we're not chasing everything. It's got to fit into that strategic plan, and when do you put which ones in what priority. Finally, marketing communications, referred to earlier. How do we take advantage of HOP? So let's just call it opportunities. I think it in itself, for me, is a brand. It's a sub-brand under the TriMet brand. And how do you leverage that in the relationship of these distribution channels of we call customers or passengers? There are tremendous revenue stream opportunities that can be here. There's some good examples around the continent and overseas who've implemented these before us. So let's leverage some of that, those opportunities. Ultimately, translate into the value proposition for the customer, enhancing the customer experience. Customer disruptions and recoveries. How do we use technology in part of our marketing plans to be, when we do have disruptions, and they do happen in every system in this business in the world, the goal is how do you minimize it, how do you bring the customer along in a proactive way and shorten those recoveries where at all possible. Again, and as you've outlined correctly, Bruce, is also how do you drive ridership? How do you drive ridership when we have capacity available, and how do you manage capacity? You manage the yield side of supply and demand, not just one or the other, because you want them to have a good experience on their terms, not just ours. And finally, embedding in our strategy will also be intended to be the safety side of the culture of making sure we could give it away for free, but if they don't feel safe and secure, they may not come. So to not ever take that for granted. Okay, so we're going to quickly turn it over to Alan to walk through the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities. And some of your comments have already gotten into that. We're going to move through that maybe fairly quickly, Alan.
What's the board doing? We're beyond our break time. I think we need a little break.
Want a break?
Why don't we take 10 minutes and come back and jump right in? Is that okay, Alan?
Absolutely,
All right.
yeah.
Great.
Good.
Still worth running up and doing what's in the
It is.
what we wanted to do is just spend a little bit of time on the SWATs. I think what we recognize is this will be, for some of you, the first time you've really gone through it. So I think what we want to do is just very briefly review the categories, and then have some time that you can think about it and get back to us with any additionals, modifications to that. I'll have Alan do that. As we go through this agenda, obviously we're a little behind. Just to check in, at the last couple items, we can probably defer to your December meeting if we need to, but we'll move it quickly as we can through the rest of it. So Alan, on the SWAT?
Yeah, so as Neil said, I'll do this pretty quickly, but want to be obviously responsive to any comments or thoughts you have now, and absolutely, if any of you want to follow up at any point, happy to do that and reflect that. What you've got in front of you is a one-page, double-sided, and then I've got the same language pretty much up on the screen here of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that we've developed within the agency with literally dozens of people involved and doing brainstorming and kind of working it back and forth and making sure we're reflecting a lot of these things. But the whole point, obviously, is to be as open as possible and understand whether there are other items that we should be reflecting. So I'm not going to go through all these. You've got it in front of you, but maybe I'll hit a couple of highlights. On strengths, the safety as an expressed core value so that it underlies everything we do, strong financial base, a proven ability to expand, actually to the earlier point, this new ridership pattern information that's coming up that we're going to be able to take advantage of and understand, the fiscal responsibility and our excellent bond rating, and the significantly improved average age of our bus fleet, so that both in terms of maintenance and the experience of our customers. And I'm just going to go through them, but feel free to stop me at any point. In terms of weaknesses, one that's common to probably most or maybe all public agencies, many competing needs for capital and operating resources, and that's part of why we're doing a business plan, because we need to prioritize and make sure we're focusing on the things that are most needed. We already mentioned the original MAX line is over 30 years old, and so we're looking at aging infrastructure and making sure we keep that up to date, up to speed, safe, efficient, and looking through. Is every employee fully embracing the safety as a cultural value? We need to continue to work on that. Training needs at all levels, and the capital asset conditions, which we already talked about, the asset management coming, and then some internal, doing the best we can for our own employees, succession planning, technical capacity, those kinds of things as potential. And moving to opportunities, or actually threats up here, end on a high note. So for threats, resource limitations is obviously a potential. The competitive local labor market is one that we're seeing, especially in IT. The ability to get great employees, as much as people want to work at TriMet, there are so many other opportunities in the region right now. The earthquake point that was made earlier, Director Prosser right there, the security of employees and customers both, the growth of TNCs, Director Bauman, that's TNCs is transportation network companies. It's kind of the technical term for Uber, Lyft, those kinds of services. The risk of cyber attack, which any public agency faces. I already mentioned the asset management review, the congestion point that you brought up, President Warner, and the sort of the expectations about what transit can deliver around community uplift and transformation. A project isn't just a transit project anymore, it's an everything project. And what are our abilities to respond to that? And then regional population migration is a little obtuse. What it really means is those who need transit the most ending up in places where it's most expensive and most difficult for us to get to them.
It's because of gentrification and.
Exactly, yeah. The pricing pressures of housing costs.
Yeah.
And then opportunities, growing demand for transit over in the long run, tempered by the short-term downturn, which we expect and hope and expect to be able to get through with the long-term growing demand. And certainly in terms of ridership, but also in terms of every community we go to wants more transit. It used to be maybe that some suburban communities not as interested, or maybe they wanted one thing and that was it. And now we're hearing so many wishes, needs, interest. We have the increased funding in place, the potential for additional grant availability, new technologies that could improve our productivity and services. The flip side of the TNC, the potential to maybe they can help solve the last mile connection to transit. Our proven project delivery history going forward, being able to do that. Doug already mentioned leveraging HOP. The regional and local growth policies, which help guide folks toward, or development towards places where transit can be most efficient and effective, so that even things like affordable housing are being developed in places that we can serve well. And then just the ability potentially to leverage the TriMet band and to further expand the diversity of TriMet employees and our contractors.
So this is a lot to absorb right here.
Yeah.
You guys have done a lot of work on it. What I heard you suggest, Mr. General Manager, is maybe we want to take a look at this, and if we have some comments and thoughts, and things other than what we might have right here, to get back to you.
Absolutely.
All right. If we got some things, let's get them out now.
Yeah, one that occurred to me under weakness is the fact that the pedestrian improvements and amenities at stops are the responsibility of the local jurisdiction and not us. And yet we keep hearing that would improve the riders' experience if A, they had a safe way to get to the stop walking, and B, once you got there, that you weren't standing in front of a puddle of water or whatever, having to leap over a drainage ditch.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I have just one quick point. You're under opportunities. The last point was expanding the diversity, and I guess I've never heard anyone say out loud that diversity in employment would include employing people with disabilities as well as other types of diversity. I guess I'd like to.
Yeah, I think that's a very good addition, and it gets to the diversity of experience being a strength.
Right, and I'm thinking it might be worth, there are others who know more about this than I do, but learning more about changes expected in the workforce, including increasing number of people with disabilities in the workforce, and how can TriMet capture that and get the benefit of having people with those differing abilities in the workforce.
Great, thanks.
Joe, did I see you had a comment?
No, not yet.
How you doing?
Well, Mrs. Lincoln? You want to comment on that?
No. I just figured it was a long night for you last night, so.
If there aren't any other comments on the SWOT, and I think to Neil and your point, please do just let us know, and we want to make sure we factor those in as we now build to the next steps. We're really at the. Go ahead.
How are we doing with the security measures for the drivers?
Well, we have a number of things underway right now. One, for example, is we're actually working on, I'll call we're testing and piloting at 3 locations on a number of buses, security cages of different variations for the bus drivers. So those are underway right now. I don't know if Harry's here or not, but I don't know the actual date that they get installed, but we're going to pilot that.
Good.
Get some feedback from the operators themselves who have to live with that, and then hopefully, I think, based on others' experience, we know from other places in the world,
Yeah.
they're usually a pretty good contribution.
The
to help.
best known methods. Is it
Correct.
That acronym, BKM? Yeah, okay.
Correct.
Well, yeah, I just, that's a big concern for me, is the safety of our employees.
Okay, great, thank you, good one.
Sometimes people vent their frustrations because they got somebody in authority, and there's the driver, so.
Yeah, the operators do a tremendous job,
You know,
and you're
they
right,
do.
he needs the support, so.
Yep.
Great point,
Okay.
thank you. Just as we wanted to, perhaps, as we're at the end of this, we've taken a lot of time with the board, we're very appreciative of it, is just do a quick check-in with you. Are you comfortable with this approach of moving to a business plan? It will take some time, and are there any overall thoughts that the members of the board may have that may help guide management?
Anybody? Joe?
Are we seeking input from people in the business community who've been our strong supporters recently with the?
Yeah, and part of this there will be at the.
No reflection upon your business acumen or Neil's or staff, but just reaching out to them and say, hey.
I think we can specifically do that. There will be a period, as one of the earlier charts we actually had as a period for public input and comment as well on this, because we know we don't want to do this in isolation. So, but I think we can specifically reach out.
I think we should. Because we have things coming up, we're going to need the business community marching with us, or
Yeah, correct.
the bond measure and the low income fare, for instance, and.
We did, Neil actually set up a small group with Alan, myself, over a breakfast, if you will, with one individual who's, I think, very seasoned in the business
Yeah,
community.
good.
And I think their input, maybe Neil, if you wanted to comment to that.
And we'll do more of that.
Good.
And we have the opportunity to do sort of two messages. One is, here's the business plan, this is what we're learning, what do you think? Seem fair? Yeah, as well as our annual budget and service plan report back related to the payroll tax ramp-up
Yeah, okay.
that we want to do on a regular basis. So that will be part of the process as we go through
All right.
finalizing this, as well as it's talking to many other stakeholders as well.
I just want to talk to the stakeholders who paid the,
Always good.
Yeah.
who have employees who paid, the head tax, so.
Yep.
So any other comments on the kind of, go ahead.
Well, I have is to thank you for putting this together and moving forward with it. Dee and I were kind of talking over at the goodie bar there. I really like how this builds off of existing work that we've done and brings it together so it's better integrated. And I think that this type of approach will have major payoff for any organization. I'm glad to see that we're doing it. So, thank you.
Ditto. Thank you. Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank
All
you.
three, excuse me.
And Dee as
You
well.
gotta be on the other end there so I can see it. All three of you, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right. Huh?
I couldn't see around.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but okay. So, Mr. General Manager, we're now moving with Bernie, and here we,
We're actually going to change the order just a little bit in
Okay.
order to gain some time. I think it'll be more efficient
right.
if Dave goes
We like
first
that.
and then I follow up.
What he really means is go fast, Dave.
Yeah. That's the way I get to push him in the back.
So, Board President, Board members, General Manager, want to give, first off, my name's Dave Unsworth. I'm the Director of Project Development and Permitting for your agency, and in such, I want to give you a briefing on Southwest Corridor. You probably know, and I'm sure you do know, that this is a collaborative process led by Metro at this point, but many different jurisdictions, Portland, Sherwood, Tiger, Tualatin, Beaverton, Durham, City, King City. Very inclusive, lots of public outreach, lots of conversations with regional partners. Really starts with a vision of how to connect the dots. It's about 2040. It's about how we grow as a region, how we connect things with high capacity transit. It's always good to show that because that's the basis of how we think about connecting the region. And really from a high capacity transit standpoint, this is one of the legs that was identified in 2009 on a regionally adopted plan for how do we connect, do a better job of connecting the region. And this shows where our high capacity lines currently are. You know these well, and this is the leg that we're talking about. It's that southwestern leg that connects downtown Portland, OHSU, PCC, Tigard, and Bridgeport to the south. It's one of that last big connectors that we have. We know that 400,000 new people are forecasted to move here. 36,000 moved here last year. Doug Kelsey's one of those. We're glad to have him, but other people continue moving here. But in the Southwest Quarter, we're seeing more of that growth. So 75,000 more people in Southwest Quarter, 300,000 people, a lot of jobs. If you add up all those jobs, it's actually bigger than Eugene from a standpoint of that. So there's demand that's happening here, but there's a lack of infrastructure in this corridor. There's not sidewalks. There's not a safe place for someone to get to a bus stop, to get to a light rail stop, to get to the coffee shop and get to the library. So part of this is, how do you do some of that other fixing we do so well with our projects as we move those forward? We know that travel demand, and you know this, you're out there, travel demand, congestion is growing, travel time becomes unreliable, and in Southwest, we have the Tualatin, the hills there, that are really causing some constraints for how we connect the dots through here. And our local bus service, we're doing a great job. I think the enhancement service, we're starting to build on that, but we're recognizing is the demand for this corridor is rather high. Done a lot of outreach, both online. So we're doing much more online through map tools, and on our last process, I think we, 1,500, 2,000 comments on things, as well as having your open houses where you're going out and making sure you're touching the community. This quarter really is focused because it's about Metro, it's about that land use vision, and it's also looking at shared investment. It's about bicycles, it's about pedestrians, it's about roadways that connect with it, and it's also building some of these centers that we connect to. So where are we? And I know that so we start in downtown Portland. We would interline one of our trains, whether the yellow line or the green line, coming through the mall. And then we have two options, either on Barber Boulevard or Nato Boulevard or Nato Parkway. Two different options with a connection up to Markham Hill. We're looking at making sure that we make that connection. There's 19,000 people that go up there a day. And then we have a couple options, either being directly adjacent to I-5 or being in the center of Barber. That really is different than interstate. This is actually keeping the number of lanes that we have here, but putting light rail in the center of Barber Boulevard. As we get further south, we make connections up to PCC Sylvania, both by improving walkways, looking at shuttle services that go up there, and even looking at autonomous vehicles. Is there a way of connecting a park-like autonomous vehicle that makes that shuttle? Working closely with PCC on that issue as we try and connect the triangle to PCC and to the Barber Transit Center, so making sure that most trains have a bus waiting for them to connect up to that campus. This gets a little bit more complicated, but there are a couple options of, let's see if I can do this. Oh, that one. So a couple options of, do you have a one-seat ride as you go through to Tigard and then down to Bridgeport, or do you have a branch that goes here? And we'll look at both of those in the upcoming draft environmental impact statement. There are other options of how we get into downtown Tigard that both have pros and cons, and we think at this point it's worth studying those, that there's enough different trade-offs that would be good for us to understand. Also, at the same time, it's knitting the community back together with really sidewalks and bicycle and pedestrians, and making sure people can get to our stations. So there is a lot other things, including potentially an overcrossing of Highway 217 and new roadways through here. As you may recall, we spent about $65 million in active transportation on the Orange Line. We will far exceed that on this line as we rebuild Barber Boulevard, as we make those tentacles out to the community, making sure that we're having safe connections to our stops. So what does it do for us? 45,000 riders are projected in year 2035. That is really a high number. And we're projecting that 1 in 4 workers in downtown will be carried on light rail. So that really is trying to build capacity in that very constrained corridor by providing that mobility that occurs there. Up to 14 stations. We also realize this is not the network of streets out here, the cul-de-sac nature of parts of Southwest. We know that we're going to have park and ride here, so we could see up to 3,000 park and ride spaces. We have a lot of different choices out here. Updated transit centers, Also, a new operating and maintenance facility that will take some of the pressure off our operations of getting our trains out on time. And as well as we're already doing some of that near-term coordination with the service enhancement plans. Again, I mentioned a lot of bike and ped and new roadway connections. And it's really about the places. So what we hear from the city of Portland, Tigard, Tualatin is we really want our cities to grow up and we want them to be served great with transit. So we're looking at housing opportunities. We just Metro got a federal grant to look at access to employment and affordable housing along this corridor. We think that's going to be an important voice that we hear as we look through here. And there's 45,000 students along this alignment. How do you connect them to work? How do you connect them to home? It's a really important corridor. So a project could, and we don't know, and we'll be updating our costs, could be $2 to $2.4 billion. Seems like a lot of money, but that's certainly on par with projects we're seeing around the country. What we would see is 50% of that coming from our new starts. That's those federal discretionary dollars that we have used all the way back to the Banfield, actually back to the West Side line. They are discretionary. For this project cost, for that, they will match 50%, and the project has to be over $300 million, so check on both of those. Small starts, which Kelly Betteridge will talk about later, is what we're going after for PAL division. It's meant for smaller, it's less than $300 million, and it caps the federal part at $100 million. So if we get that $1 to $1.2 billion, and there's no sure thing about that, although we've been very good at competing for these dollars in the past, then we look at how do we fill the rest of the bucket. Regional flexible funds through Bernie's great work and Neil's great work, we were able to secure $70 to $80 million for Southwest Corridor and $25 million for PAL Division. That would be counted towards our local match. We'll potentially be looking at a regional bond in November 2018. You'll hear a little bit more about that from Bernie. Maybe we'll look at lottery-backed bonds. Construction period financing, it's a method that we've used to count our construction period interest, both as a funding and a cost, and we'll look at that again. And we'll look at our partners, as we always have at TriMet, ODOT, Washington County, and the city as we look to fund this project. Mr. Esmond?
Joe, Dave.
Thank you.
We open to a P3 consideration?
How we deliver it, I think we will look at all
investment.
I think we'll look at all different methods, but and as you know, we've done a P3 being the red line, one of the first in the country, but we'll look at some opportunities as we move forward.
Good. Okay.
Where are we? So we are really, right now, very excitingly, we have a recommendation in front of Neil and the steering committee in December 2016 of some of the refined alternatives that we move forward. Yesterday, we hired a NEPA consultant, environmental consultant, to make us move forward. In the summer of 2017, we'll ask Mother Maya with our federal partners, will you let us enter project development? That's important because every dollar we spend locally gets matched with our federal dollars if we make it all the way to the end of the process. We'll confirm a locally preferred alternative, publish an environmental impact statement in November or December 2017. That next spring, look at making a confirming locally preferred alternative. Where do we want to go? How do we want to do it? Do we want to do the branch and the through line? We'll submit for our federal rating. Hopefully we will pass, and we will pass in November 2018, that vote. And then we'll be looking at a full funding grant agreement in 2020, construction 2021 to 2025, and opening in 2025, 26. Seems pretty simple, pretty easy. There are some steps that we see for the board in the next year. So the Regional Flexible Fund, IGA with Metro, that will probably come to you. It's money coming to us, and we'll have to say, are we ready to do that? There'll also be some design contracts for making sure that we are keeping up with the process for design and engineering. Probably in this next summer, we'll ask, are we ready to enter project development? Do we have your permission to move forward in doing that? And that'll be a letter coming from Neil. And then in winter of 2018, are we agreeing on where we're going to go and how much it's going to cost? That's really the locally preferred alternative adoption. So that's the project in a nutshell. I think I probably did it mostly under 10 minutes. And I'll see if you have any questions.
Yeah, it happens when you show up late. Probably the question's already been answered, but
I showed up late too today, so we're in the same boat.
It was an act of God. But environmental. Do you think you see a lot of hurdles out there going up? Well, for the rail?
Not easy, but hurdles that we are.
I mean, as far as environmental, remedial or
no, I think we're
mitigation.
Yeah, there'll be mitigation for things that we do for stormwater. There'll be
Okay, but
there'll be
nothing.
from a standpoint of where
We don't have
we,
a bunch of petroleum tanks sitting on the
no,
corporate board.
from hazardous material, no. I think the challenge that we went through the Orange Line has well trained us for the next alignment. The challenges of going over Major River, going through 3 industrial districts, that complexity of the 9 rivers that we crossed. We've got a team that's really well managed and ready to attack this project.
Good. Other questions?
Thank you.
I'll take my leave. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
Dave.
you, Dave.
Yeah.
So Dave touched on the basics of the project, and the key piece of this that I want to talk about and address is a potential funding strategy moving forward for the Southwest Corridor project. I'm going to skip the first couple of slides and go to the potential funding sources. So, as Dave mentioned, federal new starts, those are discretionary dollars that we can compete for and have competed for very well over the decades. Those are dollars that go to other communities around the country if we don't compete for them. And the federal government will match the local share 50-50. So we leverage a federal dollar for each dollar we are able to generate locally. The other components of the funding strategy are likely to be, firstly, a request to the state legislature for lottery-backed bonds. We've done that on a number of projects. West Side project and the Orange Line both had a lottery-backed bonding component to them. That resource is not as, it's more restricted than it's been in the past just because of other demands for lottery dollars and other programs that have been bonded. But we will make that request, and we're targeting a request in the neighborhood of $150 million. As Dave mentioned, regional flexible funds are another resource. JPACT and the Metro Council did approve $80 million in regional flexible funds for the project, so that's a good foundation that we can build on. And then in past projects, we've rounded out the project financing with local contributions, so those typically comes from urban renewal districts, systems development charges, or local improvement district charges, TriMet bonding, and other sort of smaller amounts that we cobble together. And for the last few projects, those resources have been sufficient to put together the entirety of the package. In this corridor, there's 2 factors at play. One is that the project's bigger from a financial standpoint than the last couple of projects that we've done. And secondly, some of these local contributions are not as readily available as they have been for projects in the recent past. So we don't pass through an urban renewal area in this alignment, for example. The ability to leverage SDCs is there, but it's not quite as robust as it was for Orange Line in the South Waterfront, where the city could add an SDC overlay on top of the existing SDCs. TriMet will continue to do bonding, but obviously for a project of the $2 billion magnitude, we max out at a certain point. So the question is then, what are the things that you can add to that puzzle to bring the financing plan together? And the one that we've used historically has been a regional bond ask. So the TriMet board putting a measure out on the ballot for the region to consider as a funding mechanism for the project. So we started a series of projects to ask the public what kinds of factors they would be looking at in terms of a regional funding measure. And the first question we asked them really was basic. What are the transportation issues that are of concern to you? And congestion just jumps off the page. It's by far and away the issue that the public is most concerned about when it comes to transportation issues. And that's relatively new. If you track polls over the years, maintenance and preservation and safety typically have been the higher level concerns. And you can see, sort of relatively speaking, Washington County at a very high level there in terms of their concern. And then we asked sort of the intensity of that concern. So is it a very serious problem or a serious problem? And again, those numbers are very high in the 70s in terms of the level of concern that the public has about the congestion issue. So we know that it's an issue, and we know it's very strongly felt. So we then asked if there was a package of transportation improvements that you had the opportunity to vote on, what mix of types of projects would you be most interested in? We asked about, a mix that's mostly the bike ped side, mostly the transit side, mostly the road side. And what we determined is that really the public is interested in a balanced system, and they see the need for investment not in any one mode, but in a variety of modes. And this, of course, is what, as policymakers, we've been saying all along, and it's gratifying to see that we're in alignment with the public on this, that really it is a transportation system that has lots of elements to it, and a lot of those elements need additional resources. So then we asked, would you be willing to pay a bit more for a package of improvements that included roads and transit and bike and ped facilities, and that was aimed at addressing the congestion issue? And the response was very, very strong. You can see 70% region-wide, a bit higher than that in Washington County, a bit lower than that in Clackamas County, but overall a very strong response. Now, we didn't give them a particular amount of money, we just said some additional money, so we left that open. But clearly there's a doorway there that at least can be explored in terms of additional funding for a transportation package. So because of the message that we got in the initial polling about the importance of congestion, we began to look for projects and programs that would be of greatest interest to the public that would address congestion and their concerns about congestion. So we asked about arterials, we asked about city streets, and we asked about highways and major facilities. And the response that we got back was really that it's the major road facilities that the public is most concerned about and most interested in seeing addressed in terms of the congestion issue. So refining that conversation a little bit further, we asked about 3 projects that ODOT identified as the most difficult problems that they have in the region relative to congestion. And those were Highway 217 in Washington County, Highway 205, I-205 in Clackamas County, and the Rose Quarter I-5 interchange area in Portland. And we asked the public, if these were the projects that were being considered for assistance, would you be supportive of that? And they very strongly responded to that. So all of this leads up to a series of, we call this the domino chart. So a series of dominoes that would need to fall in order for us to be in a position to come to you in 2018 to ask for your approval to refer a bond measure to the election. The first domino that we needed to fall was that we approve light rail as the mode in Southwest Corridor, which was done by the steering committee, that we work with JPACT and Metro Council to allocate funding to the Southwest Corridor out of the Regional Flexible Fund, which is the $80 million that we mentioned earlier. And the third was to get regional funding to help develop these three major projects for inclusion in a bond measure. As you can imagine, these are multi-million-dollar projects and fixes at these locations, and it takes a significant amount of work on the part of ODOT to do the technical work to make sure those projects are in a position to ask for and receive funding. So one of the dominoes that had to fall was for the region to agree to put some resources into studying solutions to the congestion in those locations. All three of those conditions were met, and so we moved forward. The next condition that needs to be met is for the citizens of Tigard to adopt a resolution or an ordinance that addresses the city charter requirements that there be a affirmative vote in the community on light rail before it can move forward. And so that measure was placed on the ballot by the city council, was voted on yesterday. It appears to be passing at this point. We've still got a few ballots left out, but it looks like that will be successful. That then lays the groundwork for us to go to this upcoming session of the legislature and ask for lottery funds, which I mentioned earlier, and also for a repassage of a land use final order. We have a special piece of legislation that governs the review of land use final orders for light rail projects because of the federal window for approval. We don't want to spend $40 million to get a LUFO and then have the land use process hold us hostage for 2 years, and then we get kicked out of the federal queue and we essentially lose that $40 million investment. So, yeah.
Did that sunset?
It didn't sunset, but the previous version only covered the south-north corridor, and it doesn't encompass the southwest corridor. So we're looking to redo that, and we really wouldn't be in a position to ask for that unless Tigard had approved the ballot measure.
Does everybody understand what this is all about? This is so there's one entity making a final land use decision, as opposed to every entity along the light rail line having to make their own individual land use decision, which just provides opportunities for time and appeals, and doesn't work well on a mega project like this. So
when you're crossing multiple jurisdictional boundaries, and all of the plans for the local jurisdictions are not exactly identical, it makes it difficult to adopt a land use final order that checks every single box. So assuming that we are successful in the 2017 session, we will then by the fall of 2017 take the work that ODOT does for those regional congestion projects, develop an intergovernmental agreement with ODOT that should the bond measure pass, those projects which they've done the work on will be built with the amount that would be included in a bond measure. So it'll be a unique circumstance for ODOT to sign what is essentially what we sign every time we do a light rail project, which is a full funding grant agreement. So they're agreeing to deliver projects if the regional bond measure is successful at delivering them the finances to build them.
Within the budget provided.
Within the budget provided, exactly. And so assuming that we are able to get finalization of that intergovernmental agreement, that would put us in a position, and we also then would adopt a series of actions around the light rail project, the locally preferred alternative. So the project has all of the sort of where the stations are going to be and how long it's going to be, how much it's going to cost, how many riders, and all those questions would be addressed. We would then be in a position in the summer of 2018 to come back to the board and ask you to consider placing a measure on the ballot in November of 2018, and that measure would be a funding measure for both the Southwest Corridor and for these congestion mitigation projects. So those would be combined into one measure, and that addresses the issue or is formatted in a way that the public is seeing that shared investment, that it's both roads and transit and bike ped in a more or less balanced package. So responding to what the voters have told us they're interested in seeing. So those are the three things that we have in play in the session coming up. Obviously, having a transportation package pass makes it much easier for ODOT to participate in the funding of those three congestion projects, the lottery dollars I mentioned for the project, and the land use final order legislation. And so just a brief update on, this is not, although it's not something we've done in the last couple of years, we have had a regional bond measure pass in the past. And what you're seeing in other regions around, particularly on the West Coast, is very significant initiatives to adopt local funding measures for a combination of transit and road investments. I think what these cities up and down the West Coast are finding is that the level of federal and state funding that's available is just not sufficient to meet the needs that they're seeing, both on the congestion side and the transportation side. So just checked earlier today the return. So San Diego had an $18 billion measure on the ballot. That, while it received 56% of the vote, they have to get to 2/3. So that one failed, but it got a majority. Santa Clara at $6.5 billion, BART at $3.5 billion, LA at essentially $100 billion over 40 years, and Sound Transit at $20 billion, all passed up and down the West Coast. And so those that I mentioned in California all had to get a 2/3 majority, so they passed with a super majority. So, so this is not unusual up and down the West Coast. This is really beginning to be sort of the standard approach to funding the kind of infrastructure that's needed in the community.
So the source of those fundings?
They are a mix. Most of the California measures are sales tax, but a number of them include a property tax element as well,
okay.
and some of them include, for example, Sound Transit's measure includes a vehicle fee component. Joe?
Somewhere, do we have the impact of congestion on freight mobility cost?
Well, we don't, but the Portland Business Alliance and the Port of Portland have done 2 studies on that issue over the years. The last one they did was I think about 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. Yes, and it's a very significant impact, both in terms of gross product for the region and in employment. So it costs jobs because businesses are putting more money into dealing with freight delay. They're putting less into productivity, and that reduces the number of jobs that they can afford to pay. The bottom line for that analysis, which is really interesting, is that for every dollar that you invest essentially in building out the regional transportation plan, the RTP, you get about $2.50, $2.55 in economic benefit from that $1 of investment in terms of savings from the costs of congestion.
Do we know what percentage? Commercial freight trucks, everything from service van to semi, percentage of people on the roads?
A percentage of their time that is lost to congestion.
How many trucks are on the road right now?
Oh, I don't have that number.
Okay,
but Port of Portland has a freight study that we can get to you that has all that information.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
For the bicycle and pedestrian portion of what we're looking at, how will those projects be identified and who will be responsible for implementing those projects?
Great, yes.
Oh, and will they all, will they be limited to just the southwest corridor, or can they be elsewhere?
Right, great question. There's two buckets, I would say. One bucket is the bike and pedestrian projects that are directly associated with the Southwest Corridor projects. Those, most of those would be built as part of the project, so our contractor would do it because it's cheaper to do it that way. There are some additional bike and ped facilities that are part of what Dave mentioned, the shared investment strategy. So there's some projects that may be outside of the scope of what the federal government would pay for, but are proximate to the project. There would need to be a different mechanism to pay for those. So it may be that the city wants to add, for example, systems development charges to address the sidewalk that's butting up against the one that we're rebuilding.
Yeah.
In that case, probably what happens is the city gives us the money and we pay the contractor who is already out there to build the rest of that sidewalk. So that's one pot. The other is other projects around the region that address a specific community need. And there's a couple of efforts that are ongoing to identify projects in that category. One is a program that was funded through the Regional Flexible MTIP allocation to identify safe routes to schools. So these are basically sidewalks and crossings that are close to mostly Title I schools, so the lower income schools. And then there's another effort which is going to be funded, we think, out of the Regional Flexible Fund allocation to look at a program that doesn't have an official name, but we're calling it Middle Transit, which is kind of like the project that we did on 122nd with the City of Portland, where the city agrees to make improvements to sidewalks and platform areas, and we agree to add additional hours of service. So there are folks in the region, particularly the City of Portland, who are very interested in exploring opportunities for that kind of partnership to continue. And so that effort will have some resources to study locations where it makes sense for us. There's enough travel demand that we want to be able to add hours there, and the local jurisdiction has an interest in building out sidewalks there. And where those two things can come together, it's obviously a win-win situation.
Okay. One other question, if I may. The schedule on the project said construction, and it was from 2021 to
2025.
2025. Will the congestion relief projects be done within that same time period?
It's still to be determined. The issue there is really around cash flow. So how do you manage the cash flow both from a regional funding measure but also from the state standpoint? So if they have funds that are going into those projects, then they have to layer those in with other projects. So it's really more about timing of cash flow. And also, just from a practical standpoint, you don't want to have all those construction projects all going at the same time, because then you're competing against each other for the same workers.
Yep.
But the hope would be you would start those sooner than we start the Southwest Corridor.
It just depends. I mean, there
Oh, but-
there are some that that can be phased. That are
Yeah.
for example, the improvements to 217 are. It's not one single project that goes all together, whereas Rose Quarter would be one project. So 217 might be able to go sooner than Rose Quarter just because it's a smaller dollar amount and you can fit it into the slipstream earlier.
Okay. With the conversation further.
Yeah.
So my comment, just, so good work, keep at it. I'm pleased to see that we're moving forward somehow, yes. I think the thing we always need to be cautious of is, I think what Dan said is, don't start larding things up with everything. I think what you've just described is a fairly concise, small list of projects that we can deliver. And, there's always a desire by everybody to make the list bigger and include more projects, which makes it obviously cost more, but I think it confuses and makes it hard. So keep working to keep the list small,
Yep.
like you've got there, which
Great.
we really appreciate.
Yeah. And we will be doing a lot of listening and public engagement around, are these the right mechanisms? Are they the right projects? So we'll get a lot more feedback before we're coming back to you and asking for that approval to go to the ballot.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep.
Are we turning it over to you?
Now to
I
Kelly.
think so. I hope that's what's next. Oops.
And maybe as
You want to
Kelly-
introduce Kelly?
Yes, as Kelly Betteridge, who's our lead on the Powell Division Corridor Project, cues up the PowerPoint. I just would note that on Monday, there was, I think, a very important vote of the Project Steering Committee to advance a locally preferred alternative for consideration. We have some work to do, which I'm sure Kelly will get into, which is to sort of work through some language that would be attached to, for example, your resolution approving the LPA, which will come to your December meeting, that really spells out the commitments, if you will, to the local groups in terms of local neighborhoods and stakeholders in terms of benefits of the project and the overall transit development program. So with that, I turn just in terms of general background and where we are, and I appreciate that we got a chance to do this because this will come to your agenda at your December meeting.
Oh.
So, Kelly.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I'm happy to be here. I've had the opportunity to work on the project for the last 3 years, and I think it's a great project. I'm excited that we have a milestone that we have reached a milestone, and we have a few more in the near future. I was joking with my husband this morning that luckily I can talk about this project in my sleep because I talk about it all the time because I did not sleep last night. I was contemplating the future of our country, so please bear with me as I attempt to be eloquent while having very little sleep. So as you probably remember from our last update, the actual alignment for the project has shifted some over the last year, and so the project team has really spent the last few months diving in very deep to understand how the alignment might best operate on an all-division alignment. So from downtown Portland to the Gresham Transit Center on Division, which is what the Line 4 currently does today. It's one of our highest ridership routes, about 10,000 weekday riders, so we know a lot about how transit functions, but what we really needed to do was dig in and understand how a BRT could operate along that alignment. So as we think about the alignment, the actual character of the road, as well as the types of investments we might make in the project are somewhat different east of 82nd as opposed to west of 82nd. So as I talk about outer division, I'm really talking about east of 82nd. It's a 4-lane section. A lot of the concerns that we hear from the community are really about safety, both crossing the street but having a safe, comfortable place to wait for transit. And so as we think about the investments that we make, I think it's fair to assume that a majority of the actual project dollars along the alignment will be made in this stretch of the alignment. We'll be looking at reliability investments, which are things like near level boarding, all door boarding, transit signal priority, as well as limited stops, but also those really robust stations that you see a simulation of here where folks have a comfortable, safe place to wait for transit. And you can see in this particular drawing, we've had a number of conversations with the city of Portland about actually having protected bike lanes along the alignment so that folks that are cycling would also have a more safe environment to do that. As we think about looking west of 82nd, as you know, the street is quite a bit different. It's one lane in each direction, and so what we really heard when we had a number of conversations with stakeholders is, hey, we really like our street. Is there a way that we can sort of minimize what the impacts are? And I think that that's absolutely what our intention is. We think about the stations that are to the west of 82nd as being light touches, building on the existing streetscape, still having those really important reliability and capacity investments, which are about fewer stops, all-door boarding, and transit signal priority. But really a lot of it too is the investment in the articulated vehicles, which offer about 60% more capacity than the current vehicles. as we were gathering data and understanding more about this particular stretch of division, when folks call in and make complaints to TriMet about pass-ups, the line 4 receives the most of those complaints. And so we know not every time there's a pass-up we receive a complaint, but that does give us a good indication that this is really a place where we need to invest in some more capacity. So once we had a pretty good idea of what the design would look like for this alignment, which is 16.5 miles, it's important to point out that as we look at sort of other federal projects, for which there are dozens in the Small Starts pipeline, that the average distance is somewhere between 8 and 10. So this is a fairly substantial alignment and something for us to consider. When we did the cost for all of these elements, it ended up at $224 million. As I mentioned, a majority of that investment is between 82nd and Gresham Transit Center, which you can see there at $106 million. There's also a fairly substantial investment between Gresham Transit Center and Mount Hood Community College at $32 million. That is the extent of the project that is not currently covered by the Line 4, so it would be a new connection, and one that I'll talk about here in just a moment. Then if we look at 82nd to downtown Portland, where those more of those light touches are occurring, it's about $35 million. And then the fourth bucket of funds is for the buses themselves. So in this cost estimate, we assume 28 articulated buses, as well as a portion of the PAL maintenance facility that will be augmented in order to accommodate articulated buses. So just a quick primer, and Dave Unsworth touched on this a bit. So we are currently in the project development phase of the Small Starts program at the Federal Transit Administration. So this is for projects that move quite a bit faster. We only have a few milestones that we need to meet within the federal government. The maximum federal amount that we can request is $100 million. And as we were sort of diving into understanding more about this project at $224 million, there's some additional information that the Federal Transit Administration published about sort of thinking about existing ridership and how to be most competitive within sort of each ridership band. So for a project that has between 9,000 and 12,000 riders, to be the most competitive, it looks like a project should be about $175 million. So with this understanding and knowing that we're sort of at 10,000 daily riders, we looked at our project budget and realized that 224 is about $49 million more than 175. And so we knew that we had our work cut out for us in order to both do our sort of technical work to look through the existing cost estimate and make some necessary changes to scope in order to bring that number down. And I'll outline a few of those at a high level, but essentially we were able to come up with about $17 million in costs just to cut from the scope elements of the budget. But in addition, it became very clear that we would need to talk about a more substantial cut. And these are always difficult conversations to have, as we start off on these projects. We want the project to be everything, and oftentimes when we get to a point where we understand more about cost, we need to have more of these trade-off conversations. So in particular, we engaged in a fairly substantial data gathering understanding about the stretch of the project from the Gresham Transit Center to Mount Hood Community College. We currently have 3 lines that serve that stretch between Gresham Transit Center and Mount Hood Community College. We have the line 20, which operates something like 15 minutes during the peak and 20 minutes in the off-peak, and then the 80 and 81, which are less frequent and extend to Troutdale. So on average, we have about 300 riders that currently take transit to the Mount Hood Community College, and over 80% of those are on the line 20. So we know that that's a very important existing connection for folks that are getting to Mount Hood Community College. And in general, I think it's important for us to also understand where those folks are coming from. So a majority of folks are actually coming from East Portland and Rockwood on Stark, which is where the line 20 currently traverses, as opposed to about 40% that are coming from the Gresham Transit Center. So with that understanding, as well as the fact that about 1% of the overall student population currently rides the bus to Mount Hood Community College, we had some high-level estimates that told us that in the future we might look at something like 3% of the overall population taking transit to Mount Hood Community College. It was very important for us to engage in a more in-depth conversation with our steering committee members from the City of Gresham, Multnomah County, Mount Hood Community College, TriMet, and Metro. We all sat down together to have a conversation to say, you know, the most populated area that is within the service district of Mount Hood Community College is Rockwood, and the Line 20 currently travels through there. We had a lot of conversations about providing better service on that existing network in lieu of extending the bus rapid transit to Mount Hood Community College. So I think that those conversations highlight the importance of our partnership along the way. We've all been in this for 3 years together, and it was, of course, painful. It's always hard to have those types of conversations, but we did end up with an MOU with all of the parties, which you all will see when we bring the LPA to you next month. But I think overall, we're going to provide great opportunities for existing students and future students to get to Mount Hood Community College, while also being able to get to a project that we think is within a budget for it to be very competitive at the federal level. So just to highlight the cost savings that we identified, at the bottom there you'll see we save about $32 million by terminating at Gresham Transit Center instead of extending to Mount Hood Community College. There's also a few other scope pieces at the major intersections along Division. We had assumed more robust stations that could accommodate 2 articulated vehicles. By paring that back down to 1, we save about $5 million. We looked at some other design elements and sort of communication elements and saved another $8 million. And then we also refined our assumptions about the portion of the project funds that would go towards the Powell bus facility. So overall, we've identified $49 million in savings and feel comfortable about where we're at this phase in the project. Just a reminder that in terms of how we plan to fund the project, our current assumption is that we'll be asking the Federal Transit Administration for the full $100 million in Small Starts funds. In addition, as Dave mentioned, $25 million in regional flexible funds. The current assumption is that TriMet will be putting in $25 million in funds, and we've had a number of very in-depth conversations with our partners at the City of Portland, and they have committed to $8 to $20 million in funding, mainly from SDCs, towards the project. So we do still have a small gap. We feel very comfortable that where we're at in the project development phase, that we have identified a majority of our funding, and we think we're in good shape to get a good rating with our federal partners. So the big news is that we worked with our 22 steering committee members, as Neil mentioned, and we arrived at a locally preferred alternative recommendation, on Monday. So the alignment is traversing from downtown Portland on the Transit Mall along Division to the Gresham Transit Center. We've been doing this for 3 years. There were a few changes along the way, but I think that as a group, we very much appreciate everyone's ability to sort of adapt to new information and really do all the outreach that's necessary to bring people along for both the happy moments and some of the more difficult discussions. So this is the actual station locations that will accompany the locally preferred alternative language. We ended up with station locations that are about a third of a mile apart, and they directly serve 85% of existing riders at the stop they're currently using. So I think that we got to a place where we were really able to balance some additional reliability, but also serving our existing and future riders in a really meaningful way. So with that, as mentioned, we have our steering committee recommendation. On the 6th of December, we will go to the Gresham City Council. The assumption is that they'll have the LPA as well as that MOU that I mentioned to you, and they'll be adopting that. On the 7th of December, we'll go to the Portland City Council. We'll be working with them to identify some of the items that folks on the steering committee that are within the City of Portland are interested in having more clarity on. A lot of that is around the opportunity to reallocate existing Line 4 service to new north-south lines. So we've had a number of conversations around that, and we will continue to have those conversations through the end of this month with the hope of arriving at some text that everyone is comfortable with that will accompany the LPA on the 7th of December. We will bring the LPA to you all here on the 14th of December, and then finally to Multnomah County on the 15th. At which point Metro will package it all together and have call their body together to give us a thumbs up, and then it becomes a TriMet project, a TriMet-led project, and we will very quickly advance design and get started on the environmental process so that we can have an application to the Federal Transit Administration in the summer of 2017.
Go ahead, Craig.
I understand that this was a difficult decision for the steering committee, and not everybody was initially happy. Was this the vote on the steering committee on this recommendation, was it unanimous, or was there a minority that is still unhappy?
The way that the voting process worked was folks were allowed to have a green, a yellow, or a red. A green was, by all means, move forward. A yellow was, I have some concerns, but I'm not going to hold up the project. And a red is, I can't support the project, but here's what I need to support the project. By the time we got to our vote on Monday, we had one remaining red card. And as I sort of mentioned, a lot of that is around some more certainty about some of the underlying service reallocation of hours. Okay. So there's some process that we need to go through as an agency before we can really tie those hours to any specific new route. And so we're working together to identify the level of clarity that's necessary to hopefully move that particular group from a red card to something closer to a yellow. There were also 5 other yellow cards. So a lot of those were just around questions or concerns about mainly the underlying service, but also, to be quite honest, about the need for the city of Portland to do a bit more in terms of affordable housing. And those conversations are all part of that overall development of text that will accompany the LPA.
Okay. So the plan is by the time it comes to us, all that stuff will be worked out.
By the time it comes to you, we'll have all of the language in one place, yes.
So, go ahead.
The verb considers, what does that mean?
Well,
Is that a vote?
That's a vote.
It will be a
Okay.
vote, yes.
So that'll be actual,
It's an actual resolution that will come before you as
No.
your normal business.
at City Hall, in the city of Portland and Multnomah,
Same,
it'd be an actual vote that day?
yes.
Good, thank you.
I was just curious who else we might hear from besides the folks who are directly involved in the study on the various committees. Is there others, citizens, that we will hear from?
Yeah, certainly. So a number of the folks that had yellow cards and concerns, I think we will hear from. A majority of those folks were East Portland constituents that, once again, have concerns about how we reallocate the underlying service, and also just some concerns about making sure that the stop spacing accommodates a majority of folks that are using transit.
So is reallocation of service, that discussion, is that part of the final design or is that something we have to do later? It's not something we can do right now?
Right. Our current assumption is that we would engage in a very robust process around that about 18 months before we open the BRT. So there have been some very specific scenarios identified, and that's part of the overall conversation. But in terms of actually committing to one specific scenario, our current assumption is that we would do all of that public outreach about 18 months before we open, and then sort of lock in what that investment would be about a year before.
But we're identifying.
And they want an answer now.
Right.
Right, okay.
Well, and we're identifying the amount of hours, many of the candidates, but there are some obvious trade-offs. Hours that are available, as you would probably expect, don't do everything everybody would want, so we'll need to set some priorities, and we want to have a very robust conversation with the local community about that, as well as respect the Title VI processes and other accompanying documentation that you're used to seeing with our service investment decisions. So we're working through that language to sort of specify, give people enough comfort that we're good for the investment and that they will have a voice, very strong voice, as those decisions move forward.
Okay. So there was a couple of comments that I received in regards to, of course, going all the way to Mount Hood from the Transit Center, Gresham Transit Center. You've kind of addressed that a little bit, but I know there's a couple of elected officials out in Gresham that had some significant concerns that they shared with me. We'll get some clear picture, I guess, in December as to when it gets considered in front of the Gresham City Council. But in regards to the run up to that, is there, in the conversations with the Gresham folks, have we seen or heard anything in regards to actually effectively getting out to Mount Hood?
So the conversations that we had really revolved around developing the memorandum of understanding, and so the purpose of that was to resolve all of those concerns and issues with everyone signing off. That MOU has been signed off by all of the partners, so I feel like we're in a good place in terms of a path forward. But of course, as we march up to the request, I think that it's always possible that there will be some additional conversation. But at this point, we have a signed MOU, and I would say overall, folks are pretty happy.
I was just going to add, Commissioner McKeel and Councilor Stegman are on the steering committee, and they both voted green for the project. And I'm actually going out tonight to the Mount Hood Community College Board to reintroduce the MOU to them and ask them to sign it, which they're ready to do.
Okay. So I know there was a couple of individuals, at least one individual on the Mount Hood Community College board that voiced significant, strong concerns about our solution that we're presenting.
I think that's Director Calcano.
Yes.
And he was part of the conversation around the MOU and supportive of the final version.
Okay, so
he was a green vote.
And he was a green vote at
as it was called.
at the steering committee.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I've heard twice now from the CAT committee that they're unhappy about the reduction in the number of stops. Has there been engagement with that group around that issue?
Yeah, the request, we were fortunate to have a member of the CAT committee speak at a recent meeting, and so the request has been that moving forward, when TriMet takes over the project, we will have a steering committee as well as a CAC, and they've asked for a seat on the CAC so that they can help us work through some of those more specific design concerns. So that's certainly the intention, that they will have a seat on the CAC and be able to have those more in-depth conversations.
Okay, great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I might know one of the important things about that is making sure that if our stops a little further apart, that there's good sidewalks along the way that are accessible, that allow people comfortable access and safe access to those stops. So it's bringing both of those elements together that I think their voice on the CAC as we develop the final designs for the project will be really important.
Just one question on design, and I'm particularly concerned between 82nd and Division coming in town. Division is so narrow. How are the buses or the stations going to be constructed? Will the buses be able to pull completely off, or will they just stop in traffic at a platform and pick up people and continue on in? Because I'm concerned about the timing it's going to take trying to pull off and pull back in, particularly with the longer bus.
Sure. So the current design assumption is that the bus would be dwelling in lane, and that the dwell time would be less than it is now, and that we would have near level or level boarding and all door boarding, so folks can get on and off much quicker. So the short answer is that we assume that they will dwell in lane. There really isn't a space for them to get out of the lane.
New term, dwell in lane.
Dwell in lane.
Dwell in lane, okay, got that one. Thank you. Well, we look forward to seeing this when it comes before us, and thank you. I know this had some rocky points in it, so congratulations everybody on working through and getting to this point. It's a masterful piece of work to get there, because I know it was not easy.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you in December. Thanks. So, Mr. General Manager, I'm looking at the agenda here.
We've got room perhaps for one, not two?
Yeah, and I'm just asking which one.
I would suggest that we actually do the low-income fare if
Thank you.
John
I think
is here and available to do that.
I agree.
And the reason to do that, of course, is that we have some regional process and conversations going on, and we wanted to make sure the board was engaged right up front and know what we're up to. So.
And the first meeting of that group is like the 8th of December, is that right, Kelly?
Right. So John will go through all of that
Okay.
here.
She wasn't listening, I'm sorry.
And we'll do the core capacity conversation. I think you'll find really interesting, but we'll try to put that onto the briefing time for your December meeting. There's nothing particularly timely about that, but I think it's a very important conversation. We'll just put it on the next agenda.
All right. Well, good morning, and thanks for not bumping me. John, I know it's been a very busy, informative retreat this morning. So thanks again, John Gardner, Director of Diversity and Transit Equity. Apologies in advance, I have a little bit of a cold, but excited to give you guys an update. Make sure I get the right. So as you all know, TriMet began researching the feasibility of a low-income fare program about 7 or 8 months ago. And we've been using sort of these 4 key elements as the lens for our approach. You know, we want a program that's sustainable, meaningful, it actually makes a difference, targeted, it hits that right level of rider, and manageable, not some new administrative monster that is more trouble than it's worth. All summer we've been working with 4-9s who we contracted with to sort of research existing programs, identify potential cost models, and then bring to us some potential funding solutions, and then put that all together in a final program report that will also include some of the takeaways from rider feedback in the regional conversation. We feel pretty good about where we're at. We're finally ready to, we've had some fits and starts on convening a regional task force, but we think we have a really good makeup. And as you can see here, we have some of the region's sort of largest or most connected community-based organizations as it relates to transit and or targeted populations. And we have a good sprinkling of local electeds from each of sort of the service, the sort of counties. And we're also trying to secure regional legislators. And so this list isn't final. There's some that are depending on the outcome of the election, but we wanted to show you just sort of our spread across different potential partnerships.
We commented on the name for Mitch Greenlick. Okay.
Oh,
Greenlick, not Green.
And those are all my mistakes. So. So the first meeting is really going to be about reviewing existing program models, getting a better sense of regional poverty. We're going to talk through our Access Transit program and our efforts and investments over about currently $1.5 million into community-based organizations, of which I think we have 92 separate agencies providing increased access to transportation through those investments you guys have previously approved. But the programs we're going to be looking at in this first meeting are going to be ones that have sort of either community components or programmatic elements that we think are potentially replicable in our market, right? So we found 11 programs around the country that either had reduced bulk sales aspects or low-income program elements. And these 5 had those, but also potentially had examples of where they used e-fare to really have a good integration of sort of a low-income fare program, but also a program that they can manage. So I'm going to briefly walk through some of the programmatic elements of the 3 bolded programs. So first is King County, the Orca Lift program operated by our friends to the north. So far, the program, like I said earlier, has been helped by their e-fare system, but also helped with the adoption rate of their e-fare system. So it's a good model to sort of compare and contrast with what we might be able to accomplish locally. The community feedback has been very positive. You can get a sense that this summer when they review their program, there are about 38,000 folks have adopted and joined the program. What we've seen across the country is sort of a low adoption rates. So they were projecting between 45 and 100,000, and they're about 35,000, which we're hearing all kinds of reasons for the low adoption rates, whether it's accessibility, the eligibility criteria, the sort of chutes and ladders people have to go through, the oversight, the amount of times they have to get recertified. So those will be considerations we need to weigh when we adopt our sort of recommendations of if it's feasible or not to move forward. Their program is at 200% of federal poverty level, and they rely on community partners to do means testing. What we've also seen with their program is, and others, is the administrative of these programs are really expensive. So if you can imagine having someone in the community and or bringing on staff to do means testing for 38,000 people, that's a lot of one-on-one eligibility determination that has to be made, and then there's additional oversight. So that's a consideration, and we'll talk about that later when we look at some of the program cost models. We also looked at the Salt Lake City Horizon Pass, and this one has a fairly modest fare discount, But what was interesting about this model is how it tied itself to sort of welfare recipients' benefits, and that way sort of eliminated the need for any means testing other than they're eligible and participating in the regional welfare programs. One of the problems with this program, or potential considerations or concerns, is that it's requiring the beneficiaries to use a portion of their EBT allowance to buy the reduced pass. So it's sort of that 25% reduction, they have to use their EBT cards to actually purchase that. So as opposed to other costs and things they would normally be spending that money on. So I think the jury's still out on the effectiveness of that program. And finally, we wanted to talk a little bit about San Francisco's Free Muni program, which is a free program for youth, income-eligible youth, seniors, and people with disabilities. And so this program is, you can see there's about 30,000 youth that were participating in the pilot and about 38,000 seniors or people with disabilities. Now, San Francisco, as you all know, benefits from having a lot of Fortune 500 companies, and this program is wholly funded by Google and the Metropolitan Planning Organization, mostly Google. Still, I mean, the adoption rate is lower than they would expect. And what they're seeing is because they have a self-attested application process, essentially I fill it out and send it in and there's no verification, huge fraud, especially on the youth issue where their fair inspectors are finding a lot of people using the program that are in their 20s or 30s. So that youth element, not so much the senior disability. So that's something to consider too, and what additional problems that lands. So, I mean, when you start looking across these program models, you know, I think the biggest barrier locally is probably going to be cost. You get a sense of the questions we need to sort of run our models through in terms of eligibility threshold, the expected enrollment rate, and the level of subsidy. And then there's a lot of other sort of connected questions that arise from that in terms of take-up rate and what that means to the average ticket cost. But essentially, we keep going back to those top three questions about eligibility threshold, enrollment rate, and subsidy level. And I briefly wanted to just show you sort of the quick income chart, because we have indexed our program to look at eligibility at the 150%, 185%, and 200% of federal poverty, to get a sense of who would that affect? What families would be sort of supported at each of those ends, and recognizing that there's going to be trade-offs. And below at the bottom, you'll just see sort of recent census data in terms of our regional population for the TriMet service district. And so if we just look at the 200% of federal poverty level, we've seen that about 32% of the Portland metropolitan region would be at that. We did a recent survey of riders, weekday riders, and we found about 40% of our ridership is at that 200%, to give you some context of who might be eligible. And that was a snapshot, but I think that's a pretty good indication of what the ridership looks like. So what does that mean for cost? So what we're looking at now, based on those three cost thresholds, and again, this, you guys are ahead of the committee, obviously, but this will be the conversation with a lot more detail that we'll be walking through our sort of regional stakeholders with, is what would it take to move something like this forward, and what are the sort of intended or unintended consequences of enacting a program. One thing I don't think I mentioned with the Orca Lift program, which we're going to have them come down because they're the closest and one that can sort of walk us through their lessons learned. But B, their programmatic cost, their administrative and first startup cost was about $9 million. So to get a sense of both what it costs for their loss of revenue, but also just to manage the program, to give you some context. So based on what we've seen with other programs around the country, our math's based on a 25 to 50% adoption rate. And that's why you see such a wide swing with even the lowest threshold and the lowest amount of subsidy between $1.8 and $3.5 million. We also are assuming for a $1.8 to $3 million program administration cost. That'll vary a little bit between if we try to take it on internally, beyond just oversight of the program, but try to do the program coordination and try to do the distribution of the potential fares, and or we partner with community-based organizations to do the eligibility documentation. And one of the things I hope to do in terms of program administrative costs is work directly with OPAL. And so when we're convening the regional group, to have 2 or 3 administrative models that myself and some leadership from OPAL have sort of determined could work in this region through a procurement process and whatnot. We also did some math around the sort of elasticity model, and by lowering fares, how much more ridership would we get? And it wasn't enough necessarily offset cost. I mean, it's not going to be, look at this, we have so much more new ridership. It's actually bringing in additional resources. It will not, so it's going to cost money no matter what we do, essentially. But here you'll get a sense of sort of the program model cost. And I'd say if you look at the 200%, which, I think there's a lot of interest in that level, and then you look at maybe the 50 to 70% thresholds, recognize that's at a 25 or 50% adoption rate. I think Portland Metro has a great community of a nonprofit and community-based organizations, so I think we might have been a little conservative with our adoption rate. So just assume, if it's 75% adoption rate, then those numbers go up as well. The other thing I wanted to mention about the Orca Lift model, which I think is one of the better models out there, is in terms of how they paid for that program, is it's being supported by the different municipalities and the transit sort of departments, but it's also coming at the same time that they did a fare increase, coincidentally, of course. But that's part of sort of the reality of that program. So, as I said, we're still waiting on some cost model funding strategies that will be part of the consideration for this regional task force, and then that will include sort of what they think may be available resources or strategies to pursue to funding whatever model the committee lands on, and then that will be part of a final program report. And then we'll be bringing as part of that sort of high-level program administrative cost and models. And then I believe right now we're planning on convening the first meeting on November 30th and having another meeting in December, and then finishing up the regional task force in January with our final recommendations to Neil and leadership. So, any questions? Oh, and if for those super wonks, Neil was smart to have me bury the actual math that it took to, yeah. So, but it's there. So, questions?
I do have a question, more of a concern that as we go along with this, looking at the different point purchase price, whatever, of purchasing the fare, based on Orca, $9 million plus loss of revenue to get started. How much of that are we taking in? I hope we would take that in consideration as we continue to work on this low fare program as well. But also, what happens when the fare increase comes? I see another fight down the road. You just put in a low fare at X dollars, and now you're going to raise the fare, or you're not going to raise the low-income fare higher now, and we've only been in for, and really, I'm thinking within the next year the fare for is going to have to go up, just in light of of what's just happened in the divided states of America. We're going to have to face that in order to keep the level of service where we are now. I don't want to give another quote-unquote surprise to the low fare advocates. That's not fair when I don't see how it's going to be avoidable.
Mm-hmm. And I might have misspoke. So Seattle's total program cost is just under $9 million. So for the administrative and the fare loss, so, I mean, I think safeguards to what you're suggesting would be a percentage. So no matter what our fares are, the percentage subsidy remains constant. So if fares go up, fares go down, the riders that would be eligible for that still enjoy that reduced cost. I think that would have to be a consideration. But again, that is what that regional that trade-off, that conversation is going to entail.
Excellent point to sort of make sure the stakeholders and constituents understand that then too, going into it.
Yeah.
Other questions?
For the other agencies that you reviewed that use outside agencies to do the means testing, the community partners, is that service provided in kind, or does the transit agency have to pay for that?
So it's a paid service. Now, the in-kind is the idea that you're leveraging organizations who already do some form of means testing, right? As opposed to building a brand new model. But, you know, in our community, there's a lot of services that are only available if individuals or families qualify by income type already. So you're leveraging that. But I mean, if you think about if we had 25 or 35,000 people, the staff time to sit down with that person or review their application, you're not necessarily leveraging that. You're leveraging their expertise and knowing what to look for and how to sort of build that rapport or recruit people for the program.
But for example, with Seattle, how much do they pay to have that done?
So I think they pay a stipend or some. I think it was like 50,000 per agency, like a flat fee. So that could be something we explore too, if that's the model the committee wants to pursue. But I think, yeah, looking at sort of a per sign-up rate, if adoption becomes one of the keys for us as well, and or just a certain amount. I mean, you'd not want to give someone 50,000 for signing up 100 people, but developing some mechanism that it's sort of a cost per, right? Because that you're also trying to guard against fraud and all those things.
And one last question, if I can, is do any of these other agencies get funding from social service agencies within their jurisdictions? For example, here in Oregon, the counties primarily provide the social services. Has anybody talked to, in our case, the counties, to find out whether they would be willing to help fund this program?
Right. And so as part of the funding strategy, that is, you know, how much can we partner with regional municipalities? Now, what gets confusing, though, is if you look at transportation is a line item in any agency, whether a nonprofit, community-based, or a government agency. So what you'll see is the county might be already giving a nonprofit partner resources that include transportation costs. So trying to get to that, like, well, how much is it actually costing versus is the city, the county, the Department of Human Services, TANF already putting money out there, and maybe it's greater than what we already expect. So asking them to put more out there, although it would reduce their cost if we reduce it gets confusing quickly, but that's going to be one of the funding strategies, is to work with regional sort of government agencies to create a greater pool.
Yeah, my own feeling is I'd like us to explore other funding partners as much as possible.
Yeah.
And I'll second that. I think one of the things is that, you know, we're not a social service agency. So I think we need some help from those folks. And I think we will provide a service that will help their folks. So I think we need to have that dialogue and what they can do and how they can help us out. It's going to create a new burden or not. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, so that's what we need to figure out. So I'll be asking some questions about that too, and I'll look forward to some thoughts from others on that.
I mean, that's one of the sort of key program elements you sort of sent us forward with, was the sustainability. And if it was just as the question is, can TriMet do this, we would be probably moving forward. But it's such a collective lift that, that's why if you look back at the people we're targeting, we're trying to get a nice spread across each of the 3 counties and legislators, because to find and develop something that's ongoing is a large lift.
Yeah.
And the other question I'll have, you know, and is just trying to understand what should the threshold level be? Is it 100, 150, 200%? Opal has staked out 200%. Seattle has 200%. I've seen others with 150, and I don't know what Salt Lake City's actually is. Isn't that the one that has the?
Yeah, I think it's 150%. And Seattle is 100% of. I'm sorry, San Francisco is 100% of median, but their median income so high that.
Yes. So I just want to know how we actually can make an informed decision that actually gets to the biggest need out there.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the conversations is something that happened when we did our Title VI analysis update was, what is the benchmark regional other providers are using, so we can get closer to, I mean, poverty is poverty. We're not trying to redefine that, but what would be a level that when we talk to the county or the city or other nonprofits, that is a level that we're trying to make a difference at, as opposed to that we're so far out of the loop that our program requires a different level of oversight or eligibility.
I just like to know how they made their decision making.
Right.
On that particular point.
I was going to say, in that regard, certainly low-income housing is tied to percentage of the poverty level, so that might be something to look at as well.
Mm-hmm.
Amplify
Right,
I think
or when the city housing authority funds low-income housing, it's geared to certain income levels.
Right. Yeah.
And I think we can develop a matrix of sort of criteria, for example, that shows here's how you're eligible for other like services, just to give people context who that don't
Yes,
work on poverty
that'd be
issues.
helpful. Yeah, that'd be helpful. Joe, did you have a question?
I was the same question.
Okay.
I really think we need other people in here. Agents, no, the counties over there, City of Beaverton, Gresham, because they're all, that's part of our territory.
That's right.
And that's, to me, that's a no-brainer. I don't think, plus we don't shoulder all the burden, all the cost. I don't think that's right. So, there.
Dr. Bethel, do you have any comments or questions?
No more at this point.
John, thank you very much. I look
Yep.
forward to working with you over the next 4
That's right.
meetings.
Thanks for joining the committee.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for serving, right? Okay, so I think we're only about 5 minutes beyond the time we said for summary and closing. You know, I don't have a lot to add. I would actually like people to give us, board members give us their opinions of what they got today, but overall, I felt, you know, this was kind of a fun discussion right after the day after elections, and I thought Dan did a wonderful job, and I think the issues you brought to us were meaty and things that will help us move forward, and I hope you got what you needed from us today. So overall, I thought it was a good meeting.
Good.
So I'll start there. Craig, do you want to?
I'd agree. I think it was a time well spent. I enjoyed getting deeper into some of these issues than we normally have time to do. The one thing I would ask, though, is that for me, one of the advantages of these kinds of retreats is to hear from board members about issues that are out there that we see and that we would like staff to look at and possibly add. So I
This
think
was different that way.
yeah, so if we could have some time on future retreats to do that,
That's fair.
then it would be golden.
Director Bauman?
I don't have anything to add. These were, I think, really important topics, and I think we had a great discussion, so thank you.
Joe, I know you were late, but you can listen to the video for the first part of it. I think you'd find it interesting.
What was,
That was Dan Levy.
Dan, Levy?
Levy, so yes.
Yeah, I know Dan.
And yes, I know you do. He came in to.
Yeah, and
give us his
said,
assessment.
doom and gloom, or
No.
don't, no pie in the sky?
No.
Somebody's in the middle.
There it's in the middle, I think. That's
Yeah.
what I got out of it. Yeah.
Okay.
But it was good. So do you have any observations time you were here?
I just think we got a lot of work to do down in Salem. So,
It's true.
no, I think I'll just reflect on I went to the Revolution Conference down in San Francisco, and I want to say, first of all, you, again, TriMet is held across the country as being a leader, and let's keep doing that. And many of the staff were part of the groups and gave presentations. I'm going to have some feedback to that group on some topics in the future. One is called workforce, and we got enough visions. Let's put some people to work. So anyway, and we might need some bus service along Front Avenue. We just broke ground on the building. Part of my pension fund put $100 million into a commercial property down there. So
Where?
Front Avenue, other side of right next to the dockside inn, if you know.
Oh, okay. Yep.
You know, if
Know
you know
exactly
that-
where it is. One of
that
my-
restaurant.
One of my breakfast haunts now in the
Yeah,
weekend.
I used to know the owners. So
Yeah.
anyway,
All right.
little economic boost.
All right. Dr. Bethel?
Good meeting. I would have loved to have gotten a little bit more into the implications of what this all means politically as well as the financial ties. Just a little the kind of quick movement last night of some companies beginning to make the dial go down and make it open low this morning as to how it's going to impact, particularly as we talk about funding things. And just a comment came to my mind, had nothing to do with transportation, but it had to do something with another federal department that said over a year ago When we get to 2017, we don't know if we're going to have any money to continue to do what we're going to do because some changes that might come in. I think we're facing some of those changes, and I'm just wondering how those changes are going to really impact what we will be able to do, particularly when we start talking about what fairs look like. That's really giving me some concern right now. So hopefully as we go, the low-end fair will dive into some more, but there is a lot yet to be done, to be talked about, and I hope we will do it with due diligence, and we'll see some good projects come to the end.
Good structure. I like the opportunity to get the information in the beginning from Dan and be able to digest that, and then step into and review the potential business plan. I think the foresight of being able to produce a document like that gives us, I always say when I'm doing a business plan, it's the process is sometimes significantly more important than the actual final document, and it is. I mean, just the consensus building of everybody coming together and agreeing on a document that outlines what the next 5 years looks like, I think is incredibly helpful. Appreciated the updates and kind of how it all tied together in regards to the transportation funding and the projects that we potentially have coming down the road. The one thing I would add I just also grab a hold of what Craig had referenced, having some time for the board itself to dialogue on some of these issues. In board meetings, we're pretty tight on things, and then usually, we're not together too often outside of that. And I think having an opportunity to take some of this stuff and digest it as a board in this forum, in this setting, I think would be helpful.
Any final numbers on the Tiger ballot issue? Not yet. Okay, all right. Thank you. So anything else to come before us today?
No, thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you, yes.
And, I appreciate the feedback on this, and we'll obviously work with your board president on the agenda as we move forward.
Cool.
Thank you.
Okay.